Hey, welcome to Firescale Audiobooks. If you enjoy our audiobooks, please consider subscribing to the channel. Also, feel free to share your review in the comments section below.
Ha, ha. With each step he took, Brandon could feel his breath grow heavier and heavier as he clutched his chest tightly. Looking up, students looked back at him with worried gazes. Yet none of them dared to approach him. Is that Brandon Locke? What's happening to him? Wasn't he fine earlier? He could hear their murmurs, though for him, it was muffled. Evelyn's office was only a few distance away. All he had to do was continue to take each step. Thud dash. But he couldn't take it anymore, as his heartbeat continued to quicken, slumping down, supporting himself on one knee. Fuck. As he tried to get up, a student abruptly approached him, giving him assistance. Hey! Looking up, Brandon felt like he'd seen the student from before. He just couldn't put a finger on it. But now wasn't the time to ponder on such things. Thanks. But when he locked eyes with the student, it was then he remembered. He had realized that it was the Earth Mage, the one he had fought during the Battle Royale. Brandon Locke, right? That was all Brandon could say. He felt like he was losing his breath each second. But regardless, he had to reach his destination. Taking deep, heavy breaths once again, he opened his mouth. Evelyn's, office. Okay. The student nodded, completely supporting Brandon up, arms placed on the student's shoulder. Brandon was quite taken aback. After all the students he had passed by while trying to head towards Evelyn's office, the only one to have helped him was the student he had threatened back then. As they finally reached the door to Evelyn's office, Brandon turned to look at the man. With deep, heavy breaths, he pursed his lips. You. Name. It's Liam. Liam. Got it. Liam nodded and knocked on the door for Brandon. From behind the door, Evelyn's muffled voice rang. Sorry, I'm currently on break. I won't be entertaining students until 1 p.m. Brandon knitted his brows and opened his mouth. Brandon. Locke. Brandon. Open. At his call, the door peered open. Liam seemed confused, but quickly changed his expression as he spoke with an anxious tone. Miss Evelyn, there's something wrong with him. Once again, Brandon was flabbergasted at Liam's sudden goodwill towards him. Looking up, Evelyn wore a look of worry as she pursed her lips. Bring him inside. At her instructions, Liam took Brandon inside the room, assisting him down on the couch. After that, Liam headed for the door, trying to leave. I'll be on my way now. Wait, don't leave. Liam flinched and instantly removed his hand from the doorknob. He turned around to meet Evelyn's gaze. Seated on the couch, Brandon lifted his head up while looking at the ceiling. With deep, heavy breaths, he closed his eyes as he opened his mouth. Help! Mana poisoning. What? Evelyn tilted her head, but immediately approached Brandon. She pressed her hand on his forehead. You're burning up. Mana. Poisoning. I can see that. I'll ask you later how this happened. Help. Sit tight. This is going to take a while. Evelyn turned around to look at Liam as she opened her mouth. Name? It's Liam. I'm actually in your class. Oh, I see. Sorry for not recognizing you. Liam flashed her a smile as he rubbed his head. You have a lot of students, Mississippi. It's understandable. Evelyn nodded and returned his smile. Then, her expressions became serious. Could you do me a favor? Yes. Could you bring anyone you know? Preferably a mage with the ice, wind, and lightning. Affinity, the exact 3 elements that Brandon had revealed to the entire academy. Liam seemed confused, but eventually nodded as he left the room. Clank dash. Brandon continued to breathe heavily as he covered his eyes with his arm. Evelyn's worried voice then reached his ears. This is the problem with deviants. Brandon was confused, but he couldn't show it in his expression. While Evelyn had this celestial affinity, she wasn't exactly a deviant. Her affinity was an innate skill, something she was born with. Hence, the celestial affinity was the only affinity she had. Evelyn seemed to notice that Brandon didn't know what she was talking about. Her voice reached Brandon's ears as she continued. When deviants use too much of their elements, to the point where their mana is drained, they suffer severe drawbacks. She approached Brandon and removed his arm that was covering his eyes. She leaned close and thoroughly scanned Brandon's face. Brandon could practically hear her breathing at how close her face was. Evelyn then pursed her lips. From your symptoms, it seems like this has been going on for a while. She leaned back and placed her hands on her waist, letting out a heavy sigh. Huh. If you knew you were having mana poisoning, why did you let it get this bad? Brandon shook his head, unable to answer. Question mark. Evelyn seemed to not understand his gesture. Brandon shook his head again, but spoke up this time. Huh. Didn't know. Seemingly unconvinced, Evelyn spoke up. Let's leave it at that then. Just wait for a while until Liam comes back. Brandon nodded at her instructions and closed his eyes. Creak. Suddenly, the door opened and 7 figures emerged. Brandon, Brandon. The muffled voices rang in his ears. Brandon opened one of his eyes, scanning the figures. What met his sight was Belle, Amy, Raven, Reinhard, Rachel, Claire, and Liam. Liam had brought way too many people. Evelyn tilted her head as she knitted her brow, looking at Liam. Didn't I tell you to bring only 3 people? Liam stifled a laugh as he rubbed his head. Yes, I initially approached Reinhard to help me find the students you've asked for. Liam looked around at the people he had brought and continued. But once I mentioned that Brandon was in trouble, these guys jumped me and asked to bring them with me. Evelyn let out a sigh as she looked down. She then lifted her head up and looked at the people around her. That's fine. You at least filled the criteria. Liam awkwardly nodded, rubbing his head once again. The first one to have spoken up was Belle as she hurriedly approached Brandon. Miss Evelyn, what's wrong with him? Mana poisoning. Evelyn flatly stated. It seemed like Brandon was the only one in the room who didn't know about mana poisoning, despite reading the novel. After all, the story closely followed Raven, who was never a deviant in the first place. And it wasn't like he would remember a minor scene of an extra experiencing mana poisoning. I mean, there were over 4,000 chapters, is what he thinks. Despite having read a lot of books, most of the books he had read were about swordsmanship. He couldn't have known anything about mana poisoning. As he was lost in his thoughts, Evelyn's authoritative voice rang. Rachel, Claire, Belle, come here. Rachel and Belle immediately followed suit. Claire seemed hesitant for some reason, but eventually nodded. Evelyn's muffled voice then reached his ears. The 3 of you at least have an idea about mana poisoning, right? Yes. Yeah. Rachel seemed to pause in reluctance, but eventually spoke up. I've read about it. Evelyn didn't mind it. That's good enough. Nodding, she then instructed them. I want you 3 to channel each of your mana into Brandon. Make sure to use the ice, wind, and lightning affinity. The 3 followed suit and approached Brandon. Brandon's eyes were still closed, taking deep, heavy breaths. They lifted their hand, and Brandon began to feel mana pouring into him. Brandon could somewhat feel like his body became lighter. The treatment was supposed to be a success. However, Evelyn headed towards Brandon, leaning close and scanning his face. At her sudden gesture, each and every one of the crowd's mouths were left agape. She was too close to his face. Continuing to pour mana into him, Belle's voice rang. Miss Evelyn? We're you equals. It's not working. It's not working. What? Belle knitted her brow, as her tone had a tinge of worry. Evelyn pressed her hands on Brandon's head. All he needed was for mana of the same affinities as his to cleanse his core. At the mention of same affinities, Brandon peered his eyes open. Looking around, his gaze eventually landed on Amy and Reinhard, who stood near the door beside Raven and Liam. If he needed mages with the same affinities as his, then he needed Amy's water affinity and Reinhard's fire affinity. He didn't want to reveal his capabilities so soon, especially since he had finally cleared any link between him and Moriarty. Amy's beliefs were questionable, but he left that all up to Raven to explain. He had no other choice. The pain was too much for him. He had to save himself. He wasn't sure what would happen if he allowed the symptoms to worsen. Should I do it? A wise man once said. Fuck it. He then locked his eyes with Evelyn as he opened his mouth. Evelyn. Evelyn knitted her brow since Brandon dropped all formalities with her, but decided to let it go. What? Pour. Huh. Mana. Amy. Reinhard. Huh. Water. Fire. Affinity. What are you, Dash? Oh, realizing Evelyn's eyes shot wide open. The same went for everyone else in the room. Belle's shocked voice reached his ears. Brandon, you're Dash. Huh. Penta, Elemental. Huh. Mage. He finished for her. Once he muttered those words, everyone's mouths contoured to a silent O shape. Brandon could hear Liam gasp as well. It seemed like the revelation had left them astonished. But Brandon couldn't ponder on his decisions at the moment. Closing his eyes, he pursed his lips. Help! At his instructions, Amy and Reinhard immediately approached him. The five stood next to each other, lifting their hands and pouring their mana into Brandon. Rumble, rumble. Due to vast amounts of mana condensing, the room began to vibrate. As they continued to pour mana into Brandon, Evelyn inched close and scanned his face once again. Letting out a sigh, Evelyn's voice reached his ears. It's working. I can't believe it. You have a lot of explaining to do after this, Brandon. Knitting her brow, Belle chimed in as well. The other 7 people in the room nodded their heads together, including Liam. Why is Liam still here? There were too many people. Brandon appreciated the amount of people that cared for him. Including Liam? He was unsure. But regardless, he appreciated him to a certain degree. I have a talk to him after this. As they continued to pour their mana, Brandon could feel himself start to stabilize. The beating of his heart began to slow down, and he was finally able to catch his breath. Rumble, rumble. The room continued to shake. Belle spoke up once again. Miss Evelyn, how long is this going to take? A bit more. The colors in his lips are starting to return. She leaned even closer. It's starting to get moist as well. Yeah, everyone was left flabbergasted. Evelyn leaned back and turned to look at them. She tilted her head. What? And nothing. Belle answered for her. Her mouth was twitching. Brandon frowned. This woman. Evelyn just couldn't stop to think before speaking. Brandon could hear Liam in the corner silently muttering to himself. I should have left as soon as I got here. Raven placed his hand on Liam's shoulder, nodding his head with his eyes closed. He was as much of a bystander as Liam was at the moment. Since Liam was in the corner, he could see the entire ordeal from the side. Evelyn was bending down up close to Brandon, to the point where if he didn't look properly, it would look like they were. Yeah, asterisk. At the end of it all, everyone who contributed slumped down on the ground. They were all catching their breaths. Noticing it, Brandon abruptly stood up and headed for the exit. He turned his head to meet Raven's gaze, who stood beside him. He then muttered, "Help me escape." Raven sighed and nodded. Go. Brandon then turned his head to look at the rest, who were still trying to catch their breaths. Thanks, everyone. I really appreciate it. With his hand on the doorknob, he twisted it slightly and turned his back to them. I'll repay all of you soon. I have another lecture to attend. So if you don't mind, I dash. Hold up. He paused as soon he felt a hand pressed on his shoulder. Turning around, what met his sight was Belle with an expression that said, Where do you think you're going? Brandon composed himself and flashed her a smile. Sis, I dash. You have a lot of explaining to do. Brandon slumped his shoulder down in defeat. There was no winning against an angry Belle. From beside him, Raven just gave him a shrug. Nothing I can do about that. For the next 30 minutes or so, the only ones to have spoken were Brandon and Belle. The others were quite taken aback that even Belle, Brandon's own sister, didn't know. They gave the two space while silently listening to them. Seated face to face, Belle let out a heavy sigh. Huh, so you're saying you've only recently awakened? Yes. How recent? Brandon pondered for a while. Pinching his chin and looking up, he opened his mouth. 3 weeks ago. You mean the start of the semester. It was quite convenient that it happened on that day. But Brandon decided not to lie. It would further support his reason for not knowing anything about mana poisoning, since he was a newly awakened deviant. Now that he's revealed all of his affinities, there was a possibility that Raven might link him to Moriarty. Not just him, but Amy as well. As long as I don't use mana disruption. If he told Belle that he had been hiding his abilities for a long time, he would lose the trust of everyone around him. In short, he would become suspicious again. At the end, Brandon had asked him to hide it for the time being. Everyone else understood and decided to keep it a secret for a while. Once the government finds out about Brandon's existence, it would prove troublesome for him, especially if that man finds out. Lucian Frost, the strongest mage of the current era. Not only a mage, but a duelist as well. A complete package. As everyone left the room, the only ones who stayed were Brandon and Evelyn. Brandon had a few more questions for her, which is why he decided to stay. Looking up, Evelyn was, well, unwrapping a lollipop. Scrunch. She gave it a lick before shoving it in her mouth. Slurp. She must have not wanted the others to see this side of her. But Brandon respected it. Though Lucian was the strongest known human, Brandon had recently found out that it wasn't the case. There was someone else. Someone who had stayed out of the limelight. Brandon pursed his lips as he spoke with a serious tone. Evelyn. Evelyn's expressions crunched up, knitting her brow. Where's the formalities? Evelyn. Have you heard of the name? Brandon paused. Taking a deep breath, he continued. Jean. Jean. Evelyn tilted her head. It seemed like she didn't know. Thus, Brandon decided not to question further. Never mind. The reason he had asked her was because it seemed like Jean knew Evelyn, considering he had mentioned her name twice. But for some reason, Evelyn had no idea what he was talking about, which is why Brandon decided to change the topic. How do I avoid mana poisoning? As Evelyn was indulging in her lollipop, she removed it from her mouth and pursed her lips. You lack mana control. I've seen it in the Battle Royale. I knew this was going to happen. Eventually. So what do I do? Evelyn tilted her head. Huh? Just learn to control your mana efficiently. She spoke with a matter-of-fact tone. Don't worry, I'll teach you. I decided to take you under me after all. What? Congratulations for surviving your first month in the academy. Vanessa's voice echoed throughout the lecture room. I know we might have been strict with the expulsions and all, but you were all aware the moment you applied for this academy. She continued to walk around the podium. Silence ensued the entire lecture room, as each student's attention was solely fixed on Vanessa. After the initial 1-month screening process, the expulsion policy has been lifted for the time being. The moment those words left her mouth, several murmurs from the students reverberated around the room. But dash. She paused, and as soon as she did, the room fell silent once again. Just because the policy is lifted doesn't mean you can all start to relax. She spoke with a matter-of-fact tone. The real curriculum starts now. I expect all of you to continue improving yourselves. Walking around, she paused and closed her eyes. She then opened them and looked at each student in front of her. Here are the new rankings for the first semester. She then clicked on the white, circular device on the table. A blue hologram materialized behind her. Standing in front of the hologram, Vanessa continued. Just like I said at the start of the semester, the rest of the rankings are in the Astria Academy app. But unlike the first day of class, Brandon didn't need to do that anymore. After all, Brandon Lock 1/1, 943. For the rest of the rankings, Raven Blackheart, 2/1, 943. Reinhard Van, 3/1, 943. Rachel Asami, for /1, 943. Amy Ashfield, 5/1, 943. Claire Victoria, 7/1, 943. And unlike the first day, there were no complaints about the rankings. All of the students seemed to understand the hierarchy. Brandon Locke and Raven Blackheart had cemented their positions within the academy. Not even the Raven faction could deny Brandon Locke's efforts. Each and every one of the students who couldn't find their names on the screen were peering down on their phones. Once again, Vanessa's voice rang, catching all of their attention. But that's not all. As of July 1st, 2148, she paused. The tension became evident as each student's gazes were solely fixed on her. The room was completely silent. Then, Vanessa's voice echoed. Official rank duels are now open for the first years. Vanessa extended her hand and pressed the white circular device. Click. As soon as she did, the hologram behind her shifted into a different screen. The screen seemed to display the details for the official rank duels. Brandon squinted his eyes, focusing on the contents of the hologram. Official rank duels. An opportunity for students who believe their rankings should be adjusted to prove themselves. General information. Eligibility and agreement. Students have the right to challenge any ranker, provided both parties mutually agree to the duel. Application submission. Once an agreement is reached, both participants must fill out an application form and submit it to the General Hub. Approval process. The application will be reviewed, and once approved, the duel will be scheduled. Duel scheduling. Approved duels will take place 7 days after the application is submitted. Venue. All official ranked duels are held at the virtual Istria Coliseum, ensuring a proper and fair environment for the contestants. Conduct. Participants must adhere to a code of conduct, maintaining respect and sportsmanship before, during, and after the duel. Any form of cheating, sabotage, or unsportsmanlike behavior will result in immediate disqualification and potential disciplinary action. As the students continued to read the contents written in the hologram, Vanessa spoke up. With that being said, I'd like to announce that electives and extracurriculars are now open for application. After her announcement, chatters echoed throughout the entire lecture room. Each and every one of the students' excitement was evident. After all, ranked duels were not just a way for students to climb the rankings. It was also their chance to catch the eyes of the top guilds in the world. A chance for them to be scouted and secure their future. They didn't even have to win. All they had to do was show their potential, a reason why they should be invested in. However, it wasn't the same for Brandon. He breathed out a heavy sigh. It was unavoidable that he would become the top student. But he would have liked it if he wasn't. At the moment, he would have liked it if he didn't garner any attention, especially from the guilds. After all, he had an agreement with Jean to join the Primordials. Guilds held no value to him, and if he would catch their attention in, which he most likely will, then it would become harder to operate once he actually joins the organization. Raven, who sat beside him, looked at him in confusion. You don't seem too excited, Mr. Ranked 1. I could say the same about you, Mr. Ranked 2. Raven furrowed his brows at Brandon's statement. Feels like you're rubbing salt on my wound. You started it. PFT. The two stifled a laugh at their exchange. Rubbing his eyes, Raven spoke up. Brandon, why don't we have a ranked dude dash? Nope. A flat-out refusal. Why? You can just take the ranking from me. Do I look like the type to actually care about rankings? Raven had a point. Brandon pinched his chin, thoroughly scanning Raven's face. Yeah, you do. Raven frowned. No, I just want to see how large the gap is between us. We've already fought back then, and you lost. I never took that seriously. Sore loser. Breathing out a sigh, Raven eventually relented. Fine, but one day I'll catch up to you. You will. Raven's eyes widened. It seemed like he didn't expect that kind of answer for Brandon, though he most likely took it as sarcasm, but didn't press further. Shrugging it off, Brandon shifted his gaze to the hologram. He pursed his lips. What happened to Claire? Since Claire's rankings dropped down, it piqued Brandon's curiosity. Could it have been because of me? Of course, everyone's rankings dropped down ever since Brandon reached the top rank. But for Claire's case, she dropped to a whole new level. That's not the case, right? He didn't know. From beside him, Raven's voice reached his ears. Actually, during the battle royale, she didn't contribute much. While we were getting ambushed, she mostly sat back and left me to do all the work. Raven breathed out a sigh and continued. Not sure why, but the only time she actually acted was the first ambush. The next was when we encountered you. Brandon pinched his chin, trying to digest everything Raven was saying. After that, I heard from Amy that her performance was stagnating. I see. Several theories flooded Brandon's mind, but in the end, he couldn't reach a conclusion. He knew Claire's personality. She was often prideful in the earlier parts of the novel, but from what Brandon knew, he had never tried to push Claire's buttons. Breathing out a sigh, Brandon leaned back. Guess I'll have to talk to her later. Why do you have to do that? She's a friend. Inside the library, Claire looked at the rankings on her phone and carefully scanned it. Ever since the new rankings were announced, she had been staring at it for the past few hours. Or so. Claire. She knew her performance had dropped ever since the battle royale, but she couldn't help it. Her mind was occupied with a lot of things. Claire. She had suffered a humiliating defeat against Brandon. It wasn't even close. Brandon Locke. the younger brother of the current student council president, a deviant, a trileme, no, a pen elemental mage, and the man she had initially looked down upon. And to add fuel to the fire, he was now the top-ranking student of the first years. Claire, she had never cared about him in the first place. To her, he was like an ant, but that was before. In other words, she was wrong about him. Recently, she had been coming to terms with accepting the fact. She knew Brandon didn't actually care. He probably didn't even know how she felt about him. But for Claire, the situation was awkward. She wanted to accept him, to reconcile with him in her own way. Not like Brandon actually knew, but it was important for Claire. She had to let go of her pride and to stop looking down on people on first impressions. Earth to Claire. Snapping her out of her thoughts was Amy, waving her hand in front of her face. Sorry, is it about your ranking again? Not really. Amy sat back down and let out a sigh. Then, is it about Brandon again? Claire couldn't respond. Amy was spot on. Breathing out another sigh, Amy grabbed Claire on the shoulder. She turned Claire around to face her. Claire was taken aback as her eyes widened. With a serious expression, Amy locked eyes with her, both of her hands on Claire's shoulder. Like I said before, just go talk to him. Amy had recently informed Claire about Brandon's involvement during her rescue. As she did so, Claire had started to see Brandon in a new light. He wasn't so bad, which is why when Brandon was the one in trouble, Claire decided to help him. As if her thoughts were seemingly read, Rachel, who was reading a book in front of her, chimed in. He's not so bad. Talk to him. I can't take you seriously when you're trying to hide your manga by covering it with a traditional book. That was exactly what Rachel was doing. Rachel looked up to meet Claire's gaze as she put her book down. This is actually a trick Brandon recently taught me. So is that her basis on why Brandon isn't so bad? But something caught Claire's attention. You. Rachel cocked her head, meeting Claire's gaze. You told him about that hobby of yours? Yes. As soon as Rachel confirmed, Claire and Amy's eyes shot wide open. Amy turned around to face Rachel. I thought you were going to take that secret to the grave. Since when did you two become close enough for you to tell him? Oh, that. We're actually neighbors now. Rachel nonchalantly replied. Thump dash. What? Amy abruptly stood up, smacking the table, while Claire tilted her head with widened eyes. Amy leaned forward and grabbed Rachel's shoulder. She waved her around. Since when did something like this happen? Rachel's expressions remained blank while she was casually being waved around. Last week, she nonchalantly replied. Has he done anything to you? Before Rachel responded, she looked down and gave Amy a sad look. Pursing her lips, she looked back up to meet Amy's gaze. Yes. After Rachel's confirmation, Amy stiffened up and let go of Rachel. Claire abruptly got up, smacking the table. Thump. Claire turned to look at Amy as she knitted her brow. Not that bad, my foot. I knew I was right about him. Amy cracked her knuckles as she agreed with Claire's statement. I mean, I knew he was quite casual with me, but I didn't expect this. She then turned her head to look at Rachel. I know Brandon was one of the people to have saved me, but... She paused, clenching her teeth. That doesn't give him the excuse to mess with my sister. Agreed, let's go, Amy. Right? The two nodded at each other, seemingly about to leave. But that was until PFDT, a strange sound reached their ears. The two turned around to trace the source. Rachel's shoulders trembled as she lowered her head, covering her mouth. Noticing, Amy immediately approached her. Rachel. Fearing the worst, Amy grabbed Rachel's shoulders. Rachel, what's wrong? PFF. PFF. Claire approached them as well, standing behind Amy. As Rachel continued to hold her mouth, a strange sound escaped her lips. The two were taken aback. With her hand on Rachel's shoulders, Amy spoke with a tinge of worry. Rachel, what's wrong? Amy, I think she's about to vomit. Was she? Amy clenched her fist as she knitted her brow. Rachel, you should have told us. I can't believe he took it that far. Claire was angered as well as she turned around, seemingly about to leave. That bastard. I bet he forced himself on Y dash. Before Claire could finish, a strange sound echoed. Turning around, she saw that Rachel's shoulders continued to tremble. Then, PFFDT. Haha. A laugh escaped Rachel's lips. Amy and Claire cocked their heads. Tears started to roll down Rachel's eyes. Claire returned to Amy's side as she spoke. Rachel, puffed. Yeah, he did something. He cleaned my place. At Rachel's revelation, the two were taken aback. What the hell is wrong with her? Growing up with Rachel, the two were used to this side of her. They should have known. The two breathed out a sigh. Ha Yuka. Amy smacked Rachel's head. Smack. Claire did so as well. Asterisk. At the end of it, Amy and Claire sat back down. Rachel turned towards Claire and pursed her lips. Like I said, Claire, he's not so bad. Just go talk to him. Breathing out a sigh, Claire replied, Huh, I guess I will. But how can I approach him? He's always around Raven and Reinhard. Before she got an answer, Rachel and Amy turned to look at each other. Claire alternated her gaze between the two. Then, the two of them simultaneously turned to look at Claire. The first one to have spoken was Amy. You want to get back up the rankings, right? Yes. Join his elective. Rachel and Amy spoke at the same time. Claire was taken aback as she widened her eyes. What'd I have to do that for? Can't any of you just tell him that I had something to say? Amy shook her head and shot Claire down. No, Claire. If you want him to take you seriously, then you have to do at least this much. Rachel chimed in as well. Agreed. Pondering, Claire pinched her chin. She then opened her mouth. But why do I have to join his OIC? Amy nodded in approval. Right, since Brandon was planning on joining advanced spellcasting, then it would give Claire the excuse to speak privately with Brandon once she joins. Advanced spellcasting was a difficult elective for a first year. No, it was even unheard of for a first year to join. But if Claire wanted to improve and climb the ranks, then she had to put in the same kind of effort as the current top student. She had never planned on joining the elective in the first place. But after falling off the ranks, it was now something to consider. With her thoughts gathered, she lifted her head up and alternated her gaze between the two. I guess I'll do that. The next day, after applying for advanced spellcasting, Brandon's application was immediately accepted. Entering the lecture room, a burly man who seemed to be the professor in charge stood on the podium. Currently, he thoroughly scanned the document he was holding. Flicking his eyes up, he called out for each student's names, then looked down to check for the next name. He was taking attendance. This persisted until a particular name was called up. Brandon Locke, present. As soon as his voice became audible, all eyes tried to trace for the source of the voice. Brandon had just entered the room. He currently stood at the back entrance. And as soon as he stepped forward to find a seat, all eyes were on him. Brandon paid no heed to it and continued ascending the stairs. He could feel all their gazes on him as he eventually sat down. The lecture room was currently filled by second, third, and fourth-year students. But even the news about Brandon Locke's performance had reached their circles. He was the talk of the entire academy, and it seemed like it wouldn't die down for a while. But Brandon was already used to this as he breathed out a sigh. The professor continued to take the attendance. Shortly after, Brandon's attention was caught as the professor called out for a familiar name. Claire Victoria? But there was no response. No way. Brandon muttered in disbelief. From what he remembered, Claire was supposed to choose a duelist type of elective. Yet for some reason, her name was mentioned in the attendance list. Could it have been a mistake? Claire Victoria? The professor called again, looking left, then right, trying to find a specific person. Claire Victo Dash. Present. Before he could finish, a voice rang from the back entrance. Everyone's attention was immediately drawn towards the back where a figure stood. With short purple hair and purple eyes, she stepped forward and ascended the stairs. All eyes fell on her as well, but not for the same reason as Brandon. Paying no heed to it, Claire continued to walk until she paused in front of Brandon. Brandon cocked his head. Tucking her lip under her teeth, Claire's voice reached his ears. Good morning. Good morning. Brandon was taken aback. Nodding, Claire pulled the seat and sat beside Brandon. Yet it seemed like the current situation was awkward, evident by the silence that ensued. Claire seemed reluctant to speak to him. Brandon broke the awkward silence first. Why are you here? But to his surprise, Claire, who supported her head with her hand, replied immediately. Because of you. I heard what you did for Amy and also for Rachel. If you didn't know, the two are like sisters. To me. Thank you, and... She paused, biting her lip. Sorry. Sure, but sorry for what exactly? Brandon was taken aback once again. The former was no new information to him. He already knew that from the novels. But the latter? He had no idea why Claire was apologizing to him. But his confusion was soon resolved as Claire opened her mouth. At first, I thought of you as an ant. But it turns out you were a much bigger ant. A bigger ant. Than me. I guess what I'm saying is I was wrong about you. Ah, that doesn't really bother me. Brandon just casually waved her off. Just accept the goddamn apology. Claire frowned. Also, the reason I'm here is because Amy and Rachel put me up to it. So it's not your own choice. Technically, it is. In the end, I was the one who sent the application form. At that, Brandon finally got the gist of what happened. This is good. From what he remembered, Claire wouldn't have this kind of development during the first year. Once again, his involvement had significantly influenced the main cast, and for the better. The first was igniting a friendly rivalry with Raven, so Raven would push himself into improving faster. The second, though he was quite unsure, would be Amy. He knew Amy wasn't a pushover. In fact, Amy was secretly more prideful than Claire. Her pride wouldn't allow herself to let the incident weigh her down, nor let the people around her pity her. If it meant that they would get this kind of development early on, then it was another step into changing the novel's ending. Snapping him out of his thoughts was the professor's voice, who was still taking the attendance. It seemed like he went back to the top of the list to check if the student was actually late or absent. But the name that came out of his mouth left Brandon stunned. Sarah Ori? Present. Brandon's head immediately flicked to the direction of the voice. And as soon as he found her, their gazes met. I knew it. It is her. Brandon had actually forgotten about Sarah. But now that he remembered, he was quite flabbergasted that Sarah decided to stay in the academy. Not only that, but she took the same elective as him. An elective that wasn't quite popular with the first years due to its sheer difficulty. But now that he thought about it, it wasn't quite surprising at all. This girl, if she failed the elective, then she would be expelled. But if she passes it, then it would mean she had significantly improved in her magic. In other words, she was betting her chances. Sarah was currently seated a few rows below Brandon. Realizing, Brandon abruptly stood up and descended the stairs. Claire, who was taken aback, called out for him. Brandon, where are you going? But Brandon didn't respond. All eyes were on him as he descended the stairs. The familiar black ponytail came into view. Her lavender eyes instantly met Brandon's gaze, but she immediately looked away. And she seemed to be shuddering in fear. Ah, right. The last time she had met Brandon was when he wiped out her entire party, killing her. In the process, it would make sense that Sarah was quite afraid of him. But regardless, Brandon dismissed his thoughts. To his convenience, the seat next to Sarah was unoccupied. Thus, he decided to sit next to her. He turned to look at her and opened his mouth. Sarah Ori, huh? She didn't respond. In fact, she was looking to the side, avoiding Brandon's gaze. I know why you're here. Immediately, Sarah's body twitched as those words left Brandon's mouth. Like I said back then, I'll come find you, and I did, which is why I'm here. It sounded like a threat, but for Brandon, he was merely teasing her. Sarah's entire figure completely shuddered. She then turned around to face him and stuttered. B. Brandon L-Lock, W. A C coincidence. Brandon waved her off and leaned back. Don't worry, I'll help you pass this class. Sarah tilted her head at his words. Question mark. Your talent would be a waste if you were expelled. Sarah looked down and frowned. There was a reason why Brandon was so fixated in sound magic. There were countless affinities, and Brandon knew that. But what made the sound affinity so intriguing to him was because of its intangibility. For him, it was one of the most versatile affinities. Of course, the wind affinity had some similarities. After all, it was an evolved form of the wind affinity. If he were to become a seated member in the future, he would certainly prefer having a subordinate with a sound affinity. Snapping him out of his thoughts was Claire, who had followed him down the stairs. Alternating her gaze between the two, she sat down next to Brandon. Friend of yours? Yeah. No. Brandon nodded, and Sarah frowned. Claire pinched her chin and turned to look at Brandon. HM, I've never seen this side of you before. Brandon tilted his head in confusion. Sarah's entire body shuddered in fear. Claire thoroughly scanned Sarah's features, in which Sarah looked away. I see. So that's your type, huh? She leaned back and breathed out a sigh. Someone I know will be disappointed, but nothing I can do about that. Brandon tilted his head again, unable to comprehend just what Claire was saying. Shrugging, Brandon turned to look at Sarah, and she was completely trembling. A week had passed without any trouble. Though the advanced spellcasting elective did indeed prove to be difficult, Brandon was able to keep up. It had to be said that in the elective, a student needs to show their growth every month. If they can't meet that criteria, then they would most likely be expelled. Electives had a harsh policy, but since the students would become the future protectors of the country, no, the world, then they had to be pressured under that kind of environment. In the first place, it was their choice to apply for Astria Academy. If they wanted to take it easy, they could have opted for a different academy instead. But the benefits that Astria Academy had far outweigh the punishment. Since Brandon had only revealed 3 of his elements to the public, his growth in those specific elements had significantly gotten better. Sarah, on the other hand, faced some difficulties at the start, but apparently she was a scholar. She was quite disheartened at first, but seeing all the students around her pushing themselves to the limits seemed to have motivated her. Her application with sound magic was quite lacking as well, but her contributions to magic theory made up for it. Even the higher years were surprised. In Claire's case, she had some difficulty with advanced forms of lightning magic, but it seemed like she let go of her pride as she had asked Brandon to help her. Help in how exactly? They were clank, sparring. Evelyn stood at the back, acting as a spectator. Since Brandon was Evelyn's protege, Brandon had asked her if Claire could join their training as well. Of course, Evelyn agreed. It was a good chance to see Brandon's growth in comparison to his peers. She knew nothing about sword fighting, but what she was currently evaluating was Brandon's mana control, in order for the mana poisoning incident to not happen again. Because of Evelyn's authority, they were allowed to utilize the virtual simulation. But of course, the pain parameter was disabled. They could fight to their heart's content, to kill each other. The two were currently exchanging blows with their swords. Clank, clank. Sparks flew in the air at each parry, while the two continued to leave trails of lightning at each step. They had a similar way of fighting in the way they used their lightning affinities. But there was a certain person Brandon wanted to imitate. The strongest person he knew. Brandon took a step back and conjured a myriad of ice crystals from behind him. Unlike Jean, Brandon couldn't materialize the ice from anywhere beyond his radius. For that, he would need the space affinity. TSZZ, wrapped in an aura of purple lightning, Claire used the opportunity and instantly appeared before Brandon. It was a new technique that Claire was trying to learn. Brandon clicked his tongue. His casting time was still too slow compared to Jean. Clank. Parrying Claire's rapier, the ice crystals behind him dematerialized, shattering. Without accelerated cognition, helping him, Brandon knew he was quite lacking in the sword department. Compared to someone who had actually trained with the sword, Brandon only knew the theories. Application was different. Clank. It became evident as he was being pushed back at every exchange. Before he was pinned to the wall behind him, Brandon flashed to the side, leaving trails of blue sparks. But as soon as he did, Claire had already chased him. Clank. Once again, Brandon was being pushed back. Sparks of lightning fluttered in the air, and it actually seemed like Brandon would lose. Parrying Claire's rapier, the ice crystals behind him dematerialized, shattering. Without accelerated cognition, helping him, Brandon knew he was quite lacking in the sword department. Compared to someone who had actually trained with the sword, Brandon only knew the theories. Application was different. Clank. It became evident as he was being pushed back at every exchange. Before he was pinned to the wall behind him, Brandon flashed to the side, leaving trails of blue sparks. But as soon as he did, Claire had already chased him. Clank. Once again, Brandon was being pushed back. Sparks of lightning fluttered in the air, and it actually seemed like Brandon would lose. Think back to that day. Brandon blinked back and motioned his hand for Claire to stop. Wait. At his call, Claire tilted her head, smirking. Had enough. But Brandon didn't respond and gradually closed his eyes. What are you doing? Channeling your inner power or something? Brandon's brows twitched, but he couldn't deny it. Claire was somehow not that far off. With his eyes closed, Brandon inwardly thought. Accelerated cognition. Suddenly, the world became dull. Everything became silent. It was only him and his thoughts alone. Focused, thinking back to that day, trying to recall the fight, each of Jin's movements, his swordsmanship, the way he used his magic, the precision, the force of each strike. Oi, deactivating accelerated cognition, Brandon slowly opened his eyes. What sort of... Observing Brandon, Claire was flabbergasted. Claire definitely knew that she was winning the spar. For some reason, Brandon wasn't performing the same way he did during the battle royale. But Claire could tell that he was trying to do something different. No, the entire fight, it didn't seem like she was fighting Brandon at all. Back in the battle royale, Claire and Raven were completely outmatched by Brandon. But now, that didn't seem to be the case anymore. But she knew it wasn't a fluke. Could have been a skill? She didn't know. Ready. She was snapped out of her thoughts as Brandon's voice reached her ears. Scanning, she locked gaze with him. For some reason, the air around Brandon shifted. Claire could feel some kind of pressure from a distance. His eyes. It was somehow different now compared to earlier. But it wasn't the same during the battle royale as well. During the battle royale, it felt as if all of Brandon's moves were automated. But that didn't seem to be the case during the entire spar. But now the way he looked at her, his gaze, it felt creepy. A sudden chill ran down Claire's spine. TSZZZ. And before she knew it, Brandon had already appeared in front of her. Clank. Claire was somehow able to parry his sword, despite being caught off guard. But for some reason, the moment the swords met, the force of Brandon's swing was now heavier. Clank, clank. Brandon was relentless in his attacks, giving Claire no breathing room. His swordsmanship and the fluidity of his movements now felt different. If earlier he was having a hard time parrying her blows, now, she was now the one who had to keep up. Clank, clank. They continued to exchange blow after blow. Brandon's swing became heavier and heavier. Then, crack. Brandon's ice sword had shattered. But for some reason, CR crack. Her rapier started to crack. Was Brandon's swing just that strong? Suddenly, Brandon stepped back. And as soon as he did, Claire was lifted up by a gust of wind. AHP. She let out a yelp of surprise. Before she knew it, a myriad of ice crystals were already raining down towards her. Brandon's casting time was significantly slower compared to earlier, but he seemed to have improvised by conjuring his skill while parrying her blows. It had to be said that simultaneously using magic skills in close combat, fighting took real skill. By slowing down his casting time, Brandon was able to segregate his focus, allowing for the attack to work. Realizing, Claire cladded herself in an aura or purple lightning and instantly blinked away. TSZZZ. Just narrowly, she was able to avoid the attack. But as soon as she recovered, Brandon once again appeared before her. He left her no breathing room. Clank. Barely parrying his strike, Brandon crouched down. Boom. The ground beneath her suddenly exploded. Flames fluttered in the air as a result. Claire was sent hurling away due to the explosion. Fucking deviants. She muttered, clenching her teeth. Getting back on her feet, a force of wind suddenly pulled her towards Brandon. But she abruptly negated the force as she smacked her feet on the ground. TSZZ. Brandon appeared in front of her once again. But Claire had already anticipated this, thrusting her rapier forward. However, Brandon easily dodged it and reappeared behind her. At that, Claire desynchronized. She was completely overwhelmed. She could feel like she was fighting a completely different person compared to earlier. So all I have to do is close my eyes, huh? A man with light blue hair and sky blue eyes walked around the hall of his apartment. Clank. Closing the door, he immediately sat down on the couch. Looking at the window, the moon was already up. His stature was quite small, which was unsuitable for his age. 22 years old, and yet people would often mistake him for a teenager. No, maybe a child. But despite his small stature, people regarded him as the strongest ranker of the current era. Lucian Frost. But Lucian knew it wasn't the case. He knew there was someone else more befitting of the title, and that said someone had already appeared before him. A portal materialized in the corner of his apartment, and a figure emerged from it. The figure's jet black hair fluttered around from the portal's pressure. As soon as he fully entered the room, his ink-black eyes landed to meet Lucian's gaze. Knitting his brow, Lucian spoke lethargically. "You again." Before the man spoke up, he took a seat in front of Lucian as if he was familiar with the place. No, he was familiar with the place. This was not the first time that the two had met. Truth be told, Lucian never knew the man's real name. The man had only told him an alias. Lucian locked his gaze with the man and uttered the name that he knew. Mahesvara. The man stifled a laugh before speaking. He then leaned back and replied, "It's been a while since someone called me that." Lucian's curiosity was piqued, but his expressions remained indifferent. I go by Jean now." Jean. After that small talk, Lucian had already grown uninterested. Such was always the exchange between the two. The two would often converse monotonously, as if their tone had no life to it. Leaning down on the couch, Lucian pursed his lips. "What are you here for? Can't I meet up with an old friend?" Lucian had no reply to that. For him, everything that Jean says was bullshit, evident by his tone of speaking. But in the first place, a regular person wouldn't be able to discern a change of tone in the way the two spoke. For some reason, the two were just in sync, to the point where they could convey their tone despite speaking monotonously. "Ha ha!" Jean stifled a laugh, though the laugh was eerily creepy for Lucian, due to how lifeless it was. After laughing, Jin's voice reached his ears once again. "I confirmed it." Another one. "What are you?" "Oh." Those were all the words Jean needed to say for Lucian to understand. Despite Jin's usual lethargic demeanor, there was one thing that irked him, and Lucian wanted to poke his buttons. Jean was stronger, but Lucian was strong as well. Another SOV. Lucian was abruptly paused as the air around Jean shifted. Scanning his face, Jin's eyes suddenly changed. No, his entire expressions changed. Darkness began to spread on his face as he looked at Lucian indifferently. But Lucian flashed him a smirk. It had been a while since he had seen Jean make the kind of face he was making. With a press of his finger, Lucian monotonously said, "Zone, zone." But at the same time, Jean had activated his zone as well. But Lucian was faster. See our crack. All of a sudden, the space around them fluctuated. The apartment room that was once there was nowhere to be seen. Ice had started to creep up and cover their entire surroundings, and a frozen wasteland came into view. It was one of Lucian's skills. Zone Cositis, an ability that allows the wielder to materialize a different realm, isolating individuals entirely within its confines. Within the confines of the realm, the user wields absolute authority over the surroundings and circumstances, isolating their targets within the zone. It had to be said that an individual can only tap into their zones once they reach the 4th star of mastery of their affinities. For Lucian's case, he had the Frostborn affinity. As the entire area was completely isolated within the domain, Jean amusingly spoke up. "Not bad. You were 0.1 second faster than me this time." A thin smile spread across Lucian's lips. Truth be told, this was the first time Lucian was faster than Jean. Walking towards him, Jin's voice reached his ears. "Because of that, I'll let this slide. Know your place, Lucian." Jean leaned close to Lucian, but due to his height, Jean had to look down to meet his gaze. "That name shall not leave your mouth." All of a sudden, pressure emanated from Jean, instantly boring down on Lucian. But despite the threat, Lucian composed himself, and a smirk escaped his lips. With a press of his finger, the zone was lifted. The frozen wasteland began to dematerialize until they were back inside the apartment. Though Lucian won the zone clash, he knew it was still not enough to defeat Jean. No, in the first place no one could defeat Jean. Lucian was only regarded as the strongest due to Jin's anonymity. The two sat back down and turned to face each other. The first one to speak up was Jean. They were about to move again. Pinching his chin, Lucian locked eyes with Jean. "The wraiths, huh?" Do you know where? Most likely the academy. Will you intervene? No. Lucian was taken aback. Whenever it involved the wraiths, Jean would usually involve himself. So what was different this time? You should stay back as well. Huh. Lucian tilted his head. Now he was even more confused. There were certain names he could remember at the top of his head who were quite formidable in the academy. One of them was Evelyn Cessna, a fellow ranker with the S+ rank. There were others as well, but Lucian couldn't remember most of them. But it had to be said that most of the professors in the academy were S ranks and below, with the exception of Evelyn. A Wraithbound was usually placed between the S to S rank tier. Evelyn wasn't enough to defend the academy or protect the students. So why is Jean allowing it to happen? Was he now betraying humanity? Or was there a secret trump card that Lucian didn't know? The next words that Jean said made Lucian even more confused. The academy will be fine. He's there. You mean that? I see. That was all Jean needed to say for Lucian to get the gist of the situation. So, it's a student, huh? That being said, Jean stood up and motioned towards the corner. With a wave of his hand, a portal materialized out of thin air. Before Jean left, he turned around to meet Lucian's gaze. You'll see soon. This one is quite creative with his methods. Staring at Jin's departing figure, Lucian was about to open his mouth, but no words came out of it. In the end, all he could make out was how cryptic their conversation was. Standing up, Lucian walked towards his bed. With a smile on his lips, Lucian muttered to himself, "System." But nothing happened. Lucian laughed at himself. As if I had one. He then turned his head towards the window, where the moon was visible. 3 years. Today is July 24th. All of you know what that means, right? Vanessa walked around the podium, staring at each of her students' bewildered faces. The fact that they had no idea made her sigh in disbelief. Do none of you read the academy's curriculum? All of a sudden, a certain student raised their hand. Raven. It was Raven. Standing up, all eyes fell on Raven. Even Brandon wasn't an exception. This week is the preparation for the preliminary exams for next week. Raven nodded to himself with a smile after uttering those words. What a teacher's pet. The bewildered gazes of the students contoured into a fearful expression. And then, fuck. Shit, I haven't prepared. Does anyone have the past test questionnaires from the second years? Chaos ensued. A sudden wave of panic swept through the lecture room like wildfire. Urgent whispers filled the lecture room. Widened eyes darted around, searching desperately for an exit. As the students continued to panic, Vanessa's hushed voice rang. Quiet. As soon as those words left her mouth, all of the students abruptly settled down. Good. Nodding, Vanessa extended her hand forward towards the white circular device in front of her. Click. As soon as she did, a familiar hologram materialized from behind her. Pursing her lips, she then went on to explain. The written exam will be split into 4 parts. Mana theory, magic application, history, and wraiths. Listening to Vanessa, Brandon let out a sigh. Truth be told, he was already aware of the upcoming exam. But in the first place, he didn't need to study that much. Compared to the start of the semester, Brandon now had an ability to aid him. His trump card. Accelerated cognition, which is why he had let Vanessa's voice out the other ear as he stifled a yawn. Whom. Noticing it, Raven turned towards him and opened his mouth. You seem confident. I am. Raven widened his eyes and scoffed lightly at Brandon's reply. Lucky. I've been preparing for the past 5 weeks. I don't even think it's enough yet. Is this guy serious? He knew Raven was quite the diligent student, but seeing it up close and personal made him secretly knit his brow. He had seen his fair share of diligent students back in his old world. But this, it basically meant that Raven had been preparing for the exams a week after the semester started. Yet this guy still isn't confident. How absurd. After the lectures ended, Rachel immediately went back home to study. Just like Raven, she was quite the diligent student as well. But unlike Raven, she had only prepared for 2 weeks. For her, it still wasn't enough. Behind her was Brandon, seated on the couch. The two would often visit each other whenever they were free. After all, their units were directly facing each other. Rachel didn't live with anyone. And though Brandon lived with his sister, Belle would often come home late due to her duties as the student council president. As such, they would take turns visiting each other's unit. For today, it was Rachel's turn to be visited. Glancing behind her, Brandon seemed to be reading a book about music. But why music when it wasn't related to academics at all? She wasn't sure just how smart Brandon actually was. But for what she remembered, Brandon was ranked pretty low at the start of the semester. Since Brandon was competent in magic, then there was only one reason as to why that happened. He must have scored ridiculously low on the first test. Yet for some reason, Brandon seemed like he didn't care. Was he actually that negligent with his studies? Shrugging, Rachel continued to fill the answer sheets. Whatever Brandon was doing was out of her business. If he fails, then it would help her shoot to the top of the rankings. But, admittedly, she was curious. Why does he seem so confident? Does he want to get expelled or something? Which is why she glanced back at him. Aren't you going to study? Brandon lowered his book and locked his gaze with her. Already did. HM? Prove it. Do I have to? Not really. There was no need for it. Rachel just wanted her curiosity to be resolved. But it seemed like Brandon had already prepared. Just in the nick of time, Rachel was actually struggling with the current question on her sheet paper. Ah. Turning towards him again, she pursed her lips. Since you've already finished studying, could you help me out? Lowering his book, Brandon frowned. No, I'm serious. I've hit a wall. I can't get past this question. This was good. If Brandon had really prepared, then he would be able to prove it if he actually resolved Rachel's question. It was a win-win situation for Rachel. Sighing, Brandon put down his book and sat beside her. Grabbing the answer sheet, Brandon thoroughly scanned it. So, hold on. Currently, Rachel was having trouble with the Wraiths category. Though the book provided vivid descriptions about Wraiths, how to fight them, and such, it was quite difficult for Rachel, who had never seen a Wraith or a Wraithbound in the first place. All of a sudden, Brandon grabbed a book specifically about Wraiths. Hey, no Chia. Before she could finish, Brandon placed a finger on her mouth, silencing her. Flipping the book, Brandon's eyes thoroughly scanned its contents. But for some reason, he was continuously flipping the pages. Flip, flip, flip. Rachel's eyes widened in confusion. It was just like back in the bookstore, where Brandon was skimming everything. No, he was skimming way too fast. His eyes were darting way too fast as well. What sort of clamp? Closing the book, Brandon turned his attention back towards the answer sheet. Rachel was quite taken aback. It took Brandon a total of 8 seconds to finish the thick textbook. Did he even read all that? All of a sudden, Brandon started filling down the answer sheet. What are you? Rachel's eyes widened once again. Tack, tack, tack. And before she knew it, done. Rachel immediately grabbed the answer sheet. Scanning, the entire sheet really was filled in. But were they correct? She had to check. As if her mind was read, Brandon's voice reached her ears. They're all correct. You can confirm it with the book. At that, Rachel grabbed the book and flipped it open to confirm his statement. And to her surprise, he was right. Each and every question was filled in correctly. Abruptly turning towards him, Rachel pursed her lips. How did you? Secret. Brandon flashed her a smirk, motioning his finger in front of his mouth. All of a sudden, Brandon walked towards the piano on the corner and sat down on the seat. Rachel was proficient with the piano, which is why she had joined the musical magic and harmony elective. But does he even know how to play? Brandon then pointed towards the music book he had left on the table. I've been trying to learn with that book over there. That's not enough, though. I know. Brandon tapped on the first key, then glanced back towards her, which is why I'll try to put it to the test. Tum. He tapped on another key. Tum, number, and another. Tum, then another. Number, until the music started playing. Rachel's eyes shot wide open. The musical piece that Brandon was currently playing was a piece that Rachel found difficult to master. No, she wasn't even confident that she could actually play it without making any mistakes. Though Brandon was making a few mistakes here and there. But for some reason, he's not using any music sheets, as if he had already memorized the entire piece. The silence that once filled the room was now drowned out with Brandon's piano playing. Tum. At that, Brandon tapped the final key, signaling the end of the piece. Turning around, Brandon glanced at her once again. How was it? My fingers were quite stiff. How did you, Before Brandon could finish, Rachel immediately rushed towards him. Thud! Rachel tripped on her own foot and fell over Brandon, causing him to fall off the seat with her landing on top of him. Their faces inched close. Ooh, too close, to the point where Rachel could feel his warm breath. The two's eyes widened in shock. Bah! Thump! Her heartbeat quickened, and she could feel her face starting to get hot. Silence filled the room, as neither could utter any words. But that was until... Knock! Knock! Someone suddenly knocked on the door. The two immediately snapped out of it and abruptly stood up. A muffled voice then reached their ears from behind the door. Rachel? Is Brandon here? It was Belle. Rachel was unable to speak due to the shock. Brandon answered for her, stuttering. Yes, sis. I'm here. Okay, just letting you know I'm home. I'll be sleeping immediately, so please try to be quiet when you enter the room. Sure. Turning towards Rachel, Brandon spoke up. I should get going now. Not meeting his gaze, Rachel pursed her lips. Why, yeah. Nodding, Brandon headed towards the door and left the room. Tap, tap, tap. Tapping her pen on the paper, Rachel had been staring at the answer sheet for an hour or so. The entire time, she had been unable to focus and continue her studies. All she had been doing was recounting the event that had just transpired. That really happened, didn't it? Sighing, she lowered her head and leaned down on the table. He didn't move away either. She pressed her finger on her lips, then lifted her head and ruffled her hair. HAA, wasn't that one of those cliched rom-com manga scenes? Bang, bang. She banged her head on the table. Since when did I become a rom-com female lead? Her tone gradually got louder. In the first place, it's his fault for surprising me like that. She then looked down at the answer sheet. Smiling, she softly muttered to herself, Thank for the answers. At the same time in the other room. That really happened, didn't it? Slumping down on the door, Brandon tried to recall what had just happened as well. He wanted to have a positive impact on the cast, to indirectly push them to be stronger, even stronger than their novel counterparts. But not like this. Back in Rachel's room, Brandon tried to pull away, but Rachel's weight pressed down on him, making him unable to do so. Yet for some reason, Rachel didn't move back. In fact, it felt like her face was getting closer to his. It was just an accident. There was no time to ponder on such thoughts. Recently, Brandon had not received any quests from the system, ever since the day Amy was rescued. He hit a brick wall, and his progress was stagnating. It wasn't a good look for him. He needed a way to quickly raise his levels and his stats. But to his surprise, ever since he had reached level 4, a new menu popped up on the system shop. Stat points. For 200 system coins, he could buy 5 stat points. It was a bundle, and it seemed like that was the only option available. He had goals he needed to achieve, people he needed to catch up to, and solving the mystery behind his transmigration. Sighing, he abruptly got up and headed to his room. Laying on his bed, Brandon dismissed his thoughts and tried to recall something. The vision from a few weeks ago. He had been pondering about it ever since it happened. The only conclusion he had come up to was that it was the reason for his transmigration. But just who were those two people in the room? The figures were blurred. He couldn't see their faces, nor could he determine their builds. He was even unsure if the figures were a man or a woman. Too many questions, but no answers. After the exams, I need to investigate Brandon Locke's identity. His first agenda was to visit the Locke estate. In other words, the original Brandon Locke's home. Letting out a deep, heavy sigh, Amy walked around the academy hallways alone. Since Claire was busy with her elective, Amy decided to head to the library on her own. Recently, she had been having a hard time studying on her own, which is why she opted to go to the library for a new perspective. Perhaps she could find an answer there? And to her surprise, a familiar figure was in the library alone. His jet black and ocean blue eyes made him stand out. Recently, Amy had been curious about Raven. She was quite taken aback when she found out Raven was working with the Special Force. Or is he? She didn't know, since Raven's involvement was omitted to the public, which probably meant that he was still under training. But regardless, Amy didn't care. Of course, she knew Brandon was there as well, and she appreciated it. But in the end, It was Raven who had risked his life, just so the special force could cut the man's shackles and set her free. She owed her life to both Raven and Brandon. But recently there had been no opportunities to approach Brandon. He was quite busy, and the entire Academy's attention was on him. She turned her attention back to Raven. Approaching him, Raven lifted his head, and their gazes met. Amy. Hello, Raven. Making her appearance known, Amy sat down on the seat opposite from him. Taking something from her bag, she placed her books and pens on the table. As she did so, Raven opened his mouth. Studying as well. Yup. Need any help? She did, but she was quite reluctant in accepting the offer. She didn't want Raven to think of her as someone who is academically challenged. But she really was having a hard time, and Raven was an honor student. Pursing her lips, she tucked a hair strand behind her ear. Actually, yes. Which topic? This. She pulled one of the books for Raven to see. Mana Theory? Yes. I know the application, but the written aspect gets me confused. I see. Pinching his chin, Raven abruptly stood up and sat beside her. She was quite alerted, but dismissed her thoughts. He was just as comfortable with girls as Brandon was. Weird, but she didn't mind it. All of a sudden, Raven leaned down to grab something from his bag. He then placed it on the table for Amy to see. It was an answer sheet. It was completely filled out as well. Amy turned to scan the contents thoroughly. As she did so, Raven's voice reached her ears. You can use that as a guide to help you. Her eyes lit up, and she turned to look at him. Really? But won't you need this as well? I have 2 copies. Raven lifted another paper and flashed her a smile. You can take that one. I see. Thank you. You're welcome. At that, Amy continued to scan the contents of the answer sheet. Noticing her frown, Raven leaned close and tapped his pen on the answer sheet. Having trouble with that? Yeah. Slowly, Amy began to understand the topic with each of Raven's explanations. Ah, I see. It was an addicting feeling for her, to have her questions easily resolved. Looking up slightly, her eyes paused on Raven, who was opening his mouth to speak. Everything he said went in and out the other ear. She was drawn to his ocean blue eyes. She couldn't describe what she was feeling. All she could think about was that it was nice. It felt nice to have someone as patient as Raven to teach her. On the other side of the library, peeking at the small window of the door, Claire and Reinhard continued to stare at Amy and Raven. Nodding, Claire pursed her lips. Good. You owe me 1 for this. Reinhard frowned. Shut it. I had to take a rain check on my plans with Raven and Brandon, you know. Don't care. Now shut up. Brandon would have passed on you anyway. Sighing, Reinhard turned his attention back to the 2 who continued to study together. So, what's all this about? Surprisingly, Claire responded honestly. That girl, she doesn't seem to realize it, but she has been talking about Raven a lot recently. Oh, Reinhard raised his brow. Then does that mean? No idea. But looking at her now, that might just be the case. I see. Then what about Rachel? Where is she? She's studying with Brandon. Reinhard was taken aback. What the hell was going on behind his back? Looking at them, I think I need to study as well. Go ahead, go away. Frowning, Reinhard turned to look at Claire. I might need some help too. Claire turned around and flashed him a smile. But it was the kind of smile that sent chills down Reinhard's spine. Pursing her lips, Claire tilted her head with a smile. Fuck off. She flipped him off. Reinhard frowned even deeper. Claire was way too harsh when it came to him. That being said, it seemed like everyone was busy with their preparations. Until the day of the exams came. The exams spanned a total of 4 days. Each day was dedicated to a different subject, comprised of 200 items for every subject. That's enough. Pens down. As Vanessa's voice rang, each and every one of the students did as she instructed. Flip. They flipped the papers back and passed it all to the front rows. Vanessa walked towards them and gathered each stack of papers. As she returned to the podium with the papers in her hands, her voice echoed throughout the lecture room once again. Congratulations on finishing your preliminaries exam. I know how hard each and every one of you worked, which is why. She paused, allowing the tension to sink in. She really liked doing that for some reason. Silence befell in the lecture room. No words slipped out from any of the students. She then continued. The Academy has rewarded you with a school trip to start off the midterms. 2 sections will be paired up for this trip. In your case, Section A will be paired up with Section B. As soon as she mentioned school trip, all of the students' eyes lit up. This became evident as their chatters began to echo throughout the lecture room. Maybe I'll pick out new clothes for this trip. I'll go with you. Section B? I'll go with my girlfriend then. Then who am I going to pair up with? But as Vanessa's voice rang, they all fell silent once again. Pairs of 2 will be formed. You're only allowed to pair yourselves with the other section. Think of it as expanding your connections. More or less, Vanessa's debrief could be summarized as, each section pairing will be assigned to different locations for their trip. For Section A and Section B, the location of the trip was Everglade. Everglade was a town that was situated far out the countryside. It was located on the northern side of the country, meaning the climate would be cold. Though rural, there were urban aspects to it as well. It seemed likely that rural had a different standard in this world, as far as Brandon could remember. At that, they were given 2 days to prepare and such. And on the day of the trip, the meetup would be at the Academy's gate. Amidst the noise that continued to echo, all of a sudden, a faint glow emitted from Vanessa, and a sudden pressure bore down on the students. In doing so, silence befell the lecture room once again. Walking around the podium, Vanessa squinted her eyes as she pursed her lips. I hope you all control yourselves throughout the trip. Remember, each and every one of you carries the pride of Astria Academy. For some reason, Vanessa had yet to debrief what the pairs were actually for. It seemed highly likely that there was going to be a task that the students need to fulfill. That being said, the debriefing was finished and they were all dismissed. Brandon wanted to investigate his identity first, but there was a change of plans. If the main cast were to go on the trip, then he had to go there as well. After all, wherever the main cast would go, trouble would always follow them. They were given 2 days to prepare, sure, but from what he knew from Belle, their hometown was quite far from the main city. It would be a lot of trouble just to go back and forth within 2 days. He had to prepare for the trip as well. It became apparent to Brandon that this kind of school trip had never happened in novel. Could it have been because of him? After revealing 3 of his affinities, Brandon had noticed that the teachers were buttering him up. Maybe the Academy was trying to curry favor with him. Since he was a first year, the school trip privilege would be given to the first years as well. But then again, it was all speculation on his part. Once again, it was another storyline that he didn't know. To make up for it, he had already decided on his partner. Section A was Brandon, Raven, Reinhard, and Rachel's class, while Section B was Amy and Claire's class. But there was another person Brandon wanted to pair up with, which is why he headed directly towards Section B's lecture room. Standing by Section B's door frame, it seemed like they were already dismissed as well. While waiting for this person, Brandon's gaze met 2 familiar faces, leaving the lecture room. The 2's purple and blonde hair made them stand out. Brandon was able to distinguish them easily amidst the crowd. The first one to have spoken was Amy. Brandon, good timing. Want to pair up? Nope. A flat-out refusal. Okay, I'll ask Rachel instead. Sure. But then, Claire motioned for Amy to stop. Pursing her lips, Claire's voice rang. Hold up. I've already spoken with Rachel. We both agreed that we would pair up. Amy's brow suddenly furrowed as her tone raised. Then who do I? Raven. Yeah, that's right. Amy's hesitation instantly piqued Brandon's curiosity. It seemed like something was going on between Raven and Amy without him looking. But not like he actually cared. Brandon didn't actually know who Raven had ended up with in the novel, since he had never finished it in the first place. But then again, it was none of his business in the first place. That being said, the 2 bid their farewells and Brandon stood alone, waiting for the specific person. Just as his patience was about to run out, the person he had waited for had finally left the lecture room. Her black hair tied to a ponytail instantly registered within Brandon's vision. Her lavender eyes scanned the surroundings and eventually meet Brandon's gaze. That being said, as soon as Sarah recognized him, she instantly ran away. Hey, wait. Chasing her, Brandon grabbed her shoulder. Where are you going? Brandon. What a surprise. Bullshit. She obviously saw him. She just pretended she didn't. Brandon frowned, but immediately changed his expression. He then opened his mouth. Sarah, want to pair up? Why me? You know where we're going, right? Yes. The reason why Brandon opted to pair up with Sarah instead of Amy or Claire was simply because Everglade was actually Sarah's hometown. If he didn't know how the storyline would unfold, then it was better to at least have someone who was familiar with the place. Sarah's face scrunched up. It seemed like she wanted to pass on the offer. But she paused as her eyes darted away. She seemed like she wanted to say something as she opened and closed her mouth back and forth. But what did I? She hesitated once again. I won't bite. As those words left Brandon's mouth, Sarah's shoulders suddenly trembled. But eventually, she composed herself and hesitantly spoke up. I don't think I'm going on the trip. HM? Why? Brandon tilted his head. Don't you want to visit your family? It's not that. It's because I don't have any money for souvenirs. Blinking, Brandon was taken aback. Tilting his head, he opened his mouth. I don't think your family would mind it. Yes, but after all my mom done for me, I want to at least give something back. Once again, Brandon was taken aback. He had never seen this side of Sarah before. Not like he was particularly close to her. He had only known her for a span of 2 weeks. But because of what she said, Brandon now respected her. It was quite wholesome. As someone who cherished his own mother back in his past life, it touched his heart, which is why he had decided. Pursing his lips, Brandon met her gaze. I'll give you money. What? Her eyes widened. You don't need to do that. I know, call an investment. Brandon then turned around, his back facing Sarah as he walked ahead. Be sure to pay me in the future. Sarah stood speechless, staring at Brandon's departing figure. He didn't even give her a chance to refuse. But in the end, she appreciated his kindness. He wasn't as scary as she initially thought he was. She then called out to him with a shout. Thank you. Brandon turned his head back and nonchalantly nodded as he continued to walk away. At that, he had secured his pair and a tour guide for the trip. A win-win on his part. Sunday, August 1st, 2148. Everyone, please form a single line. Vanessa was the one in charge to escort them to the bus. Beside her was a man with gray hair and black eyes, adorning glasses. Apparently, he was Section B's professor, Oliver White. He had quite the youthful appearance despite his age, 25 years old. Following as instructed, each student lined up in front of the bus. There were a total of 80 students. 40 students from Section A and 40 students from Section B. The initiation was brief as Oliver's voice rang. Inside the bus, you are to sit with your pair. The trip will be quite long, so I hope you've brought something to entertain you throughout the ride. Standing in front of the bus, it was quite large. It seemed to be able to fit at least 200 people. But as Brandon stared at the bus, a certain memory surfaced in his mind, one that he would rather not want to remember. That being said, everyone had started to enter the bus with their pair. Seated next to each other, Rachel and Claire continued to converse with each other. Rachel's gaze eventually landed on Amy and Raven. The two sat next to each other on the other side of the row in front of her. Putting up a smile, Rachel pursed her lips. I'm happy for her. Guess the plan worked out. That guy's quite dense, though. True. I guess Amy has to up her game. Amy appeared to be laughing as she conversed with Raven. It was a wholesome sight. After everything that had happened to Amy, she deserved this kind of happiness. From beside her, Claire's voice reached her ears. And what about you? How are you holding up? What do you mean? That. Claire extended her hand, pointing towards a familiar figure, farther out in the front row. His pale white hair, that was once long, was now shorter than before. Brandon seemed to have gotten a haircut. He appeared to be nonchalantly reading a book, while replying once in a while to the figure that sat beside him. As Rachel turned her head to Brandon's direction, she immediately looked away and turned towards Claire. Blinking, Rachel pursed her lips. What about it? You're seriously not bothered by it? No. Indeed. Why would she be bothered with whoever Brandon had paired up with? Of course, she knew who it was. Sarah Ori. She had seen her a couple of times whenever she would wait for Claire to finish the advanced spellcasting elective. But whatever Claire was talking about, she had no idea. Breathing out a heavy sigh, Claire turned her attention back to the window beside her. It's it. Whatever you say. Shrugging, Rachel got back to reading her book. But unknowingly, she would sneak a couple of glances Brandon's way. All of a sudden, Brandon turned his head back slightly, and their gazes eventually met. As soon as it did, Rachel abruptly peered down back to her book. From a distance, she felt like she had heard Brandon murmuring to himself. Must have been my imagination. At that, Rachel silently chuckled. Everglade. Arriving at the town, the first thing that everyone agreed with was BRR. It was cold. Too cold, which was why Brandon had thoroughly prepared. He currently adorned a white turtleneck underneath a long black winter coat. Pulling his gloves, he let out a smile. His sense of style was usually bad, but currently he was quite proud of his outfit. It was the first outfit that Belle had approved of. BRR so sea cold. Stepping out of the bus from beside him was Sarah, who was relentlessly rubbing her shoulders. Brandon turned towards her, giving her a skeptical look. Thought you were used to this? No, that's why I am moved out. Makes sense. It didn't, but Brandon shrugged it off anyway. All of the other students continued to step out of the bus. Eventually, a familiar figure registered within Brandon's vision. Her pitch-black hair was tied to a ponytail similar to Sarah's. Her dark crimson eyes swept the view, and before Brandon knew it, their gazes met. Calling out towards her, Brandon waved his hand. Rachel, want to eat with? Step. Rachel walked ahead as if she had never heard or seen him. Brandon was taken aback. As he stared at Rachel's departing back, another voice reached his ear. Despite how smart you are, you're an idiot. Frowning, Claire passed by him and joined Rachel's side. The hell was she talking about? Bunch of nonsense. Brandon just shrugged it off. It was most likely a girl thing. Maybe it was that time of the month for Rachel. And maybe Claire too. Yeah, definitely Claire. Claire seems like she's always on her period. Snapping him out of his thoughts was Oliver. Since Vanessa was currently checking in with the hotel's reception, Oliver was the one in charge at the moment. Clapping his hands, clap, clap, it immediately gathered the students' attention. Recently, Everglade has had a shortage of rankers. Each and every group will have to complete a single quest every day. The moment those words left Oliver's mouth, the students had already mouthed their protest. I thought this was a reward. Do we really have to do that? Quiet. Let me finish. Oliver's deep voice eventually rang, silencing the students. As I was saying, in doing so, you will receive an allowance and be given the leisure to relax for the day. He had definitely grabbed the attention of the students as soon as he mentioned allowance. Everyone's eyes lit up, and it seemed like they were eager to go. That being said, Oliver continued on. The quest will be picked up inside the city's main guild hub. It was a first-come, first-served basis, meaning it was a race to grab whichever the easier quest was. There weren't any punishments if the quota isn't fulfilled for the day. It was just that they wouldn't receive an allowance. They would have to use their own money. At that, Vanessa had returned from the hotel, and everyone quickly beckoned inside. As Brandon stepped forward, he came to a sudden pause. It seemed like he had stepped on something. Looking down, what met his sight was a doll. How peculiar. Leaning down, he picked up the doll. It had a design that could be described as a little girl. But having had his fair share of horror movies back in his old life, the doll's figure sent chills down his spine. As Brandon continued to scan the doll, the hair on the back of his neck suddenly stood on end. Goosebumps. It was eerily creepy. From beside him, Sarah chimed in. She leaned close to scan the doll as well. Her brows were raised skeptically as she pinched her chin. This doll looks oddly familiar. Is it yours? Sarah then took the doll away from Brandon and hugged it tightly. No, but I have a feeling I should keep it. Aren't you too old for that? Brandon tilted his head with a smirk. Sarah turned towards him and frowned. It's cute. Brandon stepped ahead of her. Turning around, he opened his mouth. Don't let that thing near me. Oh, is Mr. Ranked one afraid of a little doll? I'll burn it. I can't believe we're staying in the same room. Neither can I. Sarah and Brandon had just entered their assigned quarters in the hotel. It was instructed for each pair to stay in the same room. This is just irresponsible, even for Astria Academy. Agreed. Nodding at Sarah's words, Brandon stepped forward and flicked the light switch on. Flick! What met their sight was a single bed, a king-sized one. For them to sleep next to each other? The two were utterly speechless as their expressions froze. From behind him, Sarah motioned to leave as her face scrunched up slightly. Yeah, I'm sleeping in the lobby. Hole. CR crack. An ice sword materialized in Brandon's hand. He then walked towards the bed, gripping the ice sword tightly. Slash. Good enough. He cut the bed in half. It was cut cleanly as well. Sarah's voice raised with an anxious expression. What the hell is wrong with you? We'll have to pay for that, you know. I can pay. Brandon shrugged and walked towards the other half to the bed. Would you rather sleep in the lobby or here? But I don't want you to watch me sleeping. Phoo! A gust of wind blew the other half of the bed away, keeping a fixed distance from the other half. CR crack. With a wave of his hand, an ice wall materialized to separate the two beds even further. Good enough. The ice is transparent. Brandon extended his hand to grab the blanket that was covering his bed. He then draped it all over the ice wall. Now the other side couldn't be seen. Any more complaints? Letting out a sigh, Sarah walked towards the other half of the bed and sat down. Brandon did so as well, settling his bag beneath the bed. Suddenly, knock, knock. Someone knocked on the door. Turning towards Sarah, Brandon nudged his chin, signaling for her to go to the door. Sarah's face scrunched up. Brandon shrugged as she did so. I did everything. It's your turn. H.A. Letting out a sigh, Sarah walked towards the other half of the bed and sat down. Brandon did so as well, settling his bag beneath the bed. Suddenly, knock, knock. Someone knocked on the door. Turning towards Sarah, Brandon nudged his chin, signaling for her to go to the door. Sarah's face scrunched up. Brandon shrugged as she did so. I did everything. It's your turn. H.A. Letting out a heavy sigh, Sarah walked towards the door and slowly opened it. Yes. What met her sight was her professor, Oliver White. He seemed anxious as he spoke. Sarah, apologies. There was a mistake in giving you the keys. This isn't your room. Sarah. Oliver then peered at the room. Then, his eyes widened in shock as he loudly spoke up. What? What happened here? Sarah turned towards Brandon, who was nonchalantly reading a book as if Oliver's voice never registered in his ears. Extending her arms, she pointed towards him. He happened. Asterisk. Entering the hotel's buffet restaurant, it bustled with activity. Students filled the entire room as they sat on the tables. Chafing dishes were aligned, separating it from the beverage dispensers. It was currently 3 p.m., and students had yet to eat. The same went for Brandon, who had already picked up his food and sat at a table. Seated at the opposite side from him was Sarah, who had already picked up her food as well. But compared to Brandon's plate, which was filled to the brim with whatever exotic food he could find, Sarah was quite picky with her food. As the two continued to eat in silence, two familiar figures approached them. His deep red hair and black eyes made him stand out. Beside him was another male student with brown hair and green eyes. Brandon was quite familiar with him as well. This was especially so as Liam was the one who had significantly helped Brandon during the mana poisoning incident. It seemed like Liam was Reinhardt's partner. Yo, Brandon, mind if we join you? Go ahead. Giving his go signal, Reinhardt sat beside him. Liam, on the other hand, seemed reluctant to sit down. With the plate in his hand, he turned towards Sarah and asked for permission. Hey, Sarah, mind if I sit next to you? Go ahead. Sarah waved him off without sparing him a glance. This piqued Brandon's curiosity. From what he could remember during the battle royale, Liam was the one who instigated to kill Sarah. Sarah must still be bitter about it, evident by her gesture. Because Sarah and Brandon had gotten quite acquainted, being in the same elective and all, the two had fixed their relationship. He could admit they were good friends. Liam gave an awkward smile and sat down beside Sarah. Brandon realized that he had never asked Liam about the change in heart. Indeed, why did he help Brandon that day? It was the perfect opportunity to ask. Turning towards Liam, Brandon opened his mouth. Liam was about to feed himself before his body twitched slightly at Brandon's call. Yes. I'm quite curious. Weren't you about to drop out of the academy? That. Liam rubbed his cheek with an awkward smile. The guy was way too awkward. I was about to actually, but Reinhard talked some sense into me. He paused and glanced at Reinhard. He then continued, I heard what you said to Sarah on the screen. At that moment, I realized we were the ones in the wrong and that you were actually a nice guy. Liam awkwardly scratched his cheek and flashed Brandon a smile. Brandon was quite taken aback. His actions had indirectly affected a character that isn't in the main cast. It was a good feeling. Nodding, Brandon looked and tried to digest what Liam had just said. Eventually, he lifted his head up and met Liam's gaze. I see. He then turned to look at Sarah, who was eating her meal silently. It was the perfect opportunity to bring it up. Sarah, what? That doll. As soon as those words left Brandon's mouth, Sarah's expressions froze. It seemed like she didn't want the two other people to know about the doll. What are you planning on doing with it? Sarah's eyes darted around, trying to come up with a reply. Her eyes then lit up as she spoke. I'm thinking of giving it to my little sister. You have a sister? Yes. I see. When are you planning on visiting them? Sarah seemed to already have an answer for that question, as she spoke up without any hesitation. Maybe later. I see. It was a brief conversation. At that, the group continued to eat their meal in silence. But the silence was soon broken by Reinhard, who had already finished his meal. You guys want to go to the guild hub together? Brandon turned towards him and pursed his lips. Sure. Liam seemed to share the same thoughts as well as he nodded. But Sarah was of a different opinion as she opened her mouth. Each pair was advised to choose only one quest and that they would accomplish it together. I'll visit my family first. You guys go on ahead. Asterisk. Brandon, Reinhard, and Liam had arrived inside the guild hub. She had told Brandon to pick up a quest before she returned. Each pair was advised to choose only one quest and that they would accomplish it together. The guild hub was quite advanced. Though Everglade was a rural town far out the countryside, the hotel that they stayed in was quite luxurious. The same went for the guild hub. The three approached the receptionist as they asked for directions on where to pick up the quests. They were instructed to go up the second floor, and a bulletin board would be situated at the center. Doing so, the three approached the bulletin board, and there were a bunch of papers pinned on the board. There were other students as well who were pondering on what quest to pick. As Brandon scanned the board, it seemed like there was still a bunch of easy quests left. This one seems good. As Brandon was about to grab an easy quest, he immediately paused. A peculiar poster that was pinned on the far corner of the board had caught his attention. He extended his hand and picked up the quest poster. As he read the contents, his eyes widened in shock. He was quite confused, but he had quickly come to a conclusion. It wouldn't take a genius to know just what the quest was about. Missing person Ori. Sarah stood in front of her family home with the doll clutched tightly in her arms. It was a small and humble house. Her family didn't have much, but despite that, they were happy. It was a small family of three consisting of her mother, Sienna Ori, and a 6-year-old sister, Emma Ori. When Emma was born, their father had gone missing. As she remembered the memory, Sarah clenched her fist, but she instantly dismissed her thoughts and fixed her expressions. I shouldn't have those kinds of thoughts. After all, she was about to reunite with her family after 2 months. Sarah approached the door and inserted her key into the keyhole. Creak. Opening the door with a wide grin, Sarah enthusiastically opened her mouth. Surprise. Mom, I'm home. She paused. What met her sight was her mother, who sat in front of their dining table. Her mother stared at the table with a blank expression. Her complexions were pale, and her body was frail. She appeared to not have eaten for days, maybe weeks, as she looked severely malnourished. Her arms were thin, and her cheekbones were visible. Sarah could see dark circles beneath her eyes as well. Thud! She dropped the doll and immediately rushed towards her mother. Mom! It seemed like her mother hadn't noticed her arrival as she turned her head towards Sarah. Clasping her mother's hand with a worried expression, Sarah pursed her lips. Mom, what happened to you? Where's Emma? Her mother met Sarah's gaze, and as soon as she did, tears started flowing down her cheek. Sob! Sob! Seeing her mother's current predicament had made Sarah's heart sink. Her mother then embraced Sarah as she continued sobbing. The tears had started to stain Sarah's clothes. Sarah returned her embrace, and her eyes started to moisten as well. Mom, what happened? Sob. Sob. Why your sister? Sarah had a rough idea. Emma wasn't around the house. Usually she would run towards her and give her a wide smile, hugging her. But she wasn't here. Sarah didn't want to admit it. She wanted to deny reality. The next words that her mother spoke made Sarah's heart crumble into pieces. Your sister, she's she's been missing for the past month. Just like her father who had gone missing a few years ago. Sarah's eyes widened in shock. Her mother, who was crying, continued with a sorrowful tone. I've sent a request to find her at the guild hub. Sob, sob. Tears continued to flow down her mother's cheek. I've used up most of our money for the reward. Sob, sob. But, thump. Sarah's heart became heavier and heavier with each passing word. But she continued to listen to her mother. No one took the request. Sarah clenched her fist as she listened to every word her mother spoke. Drip, drip. Her expressions then froze as her eyes widened. She clenched her fist tightly. This can't be real. But it was. Why, you're joking, right, Mom? But her mother didn't reply and continued to break down. Sarah, she couldn't accept it. There was no way it was real. For a 6-year-old to have gone missing for a month. That long. She would most likely be. No. Lifting her head up, Sarah raised her voice. Emma, come out. This isn't funny. What? She was about to break. Her heart. It was about to break. Please. What? Please. What? She started to hyperventilate. Emma, please. Deny the reality. Please. Hiya. Wapa. Sarah eventually broke down. Please. Emma, please. It isn't real. There was no way that Emma was missing. Wah. Emma. Sarah slumped down as her legs eventually gave out. Emma, please. The image of Emma instantly etched in her memory. The day Emma was born. It was one of the happiest moments of their lives. Wah. The first time Emma learned how to walk. Her first words. The first time she had spoken Sarah's name. Wah. The first time she had learned how to write. All her birthdays. Everything. The memory of Emma crying when Sarah was about to leave for the academy. That was her last memory of Emma. Wah. Please. From beside her, her mother kneeled down and embraced her. The two cried together as they embraced each other tightly. Emma, please. Despite everything, Sarah still couldn't accept the reality. Heartbroken. That was the only thing that could describe what the two were feeling. Someone, help. Me. Please. Date posted, June 27th, 2148. Missing person, Emma Ori. Reward, 27 copper coins. Brandon's eyes widened as he stared at the quest poster. Emma Ori. There was an image attached to the quest. It displayed a little girl who had strikingly similar features as Sarah, only that the girl was younger. There was no doubt about it. It was in fact Sarah's little sister. Realizing, Brandon gripped the poster tightly to the point where it started to crease. He then turned around and looked at the rankers present. They sat around and continued to converse and laugh with one another. Clenching his teeth, Brandon screamed out loud. Hey! He immediately grabbed the rankers' attention as they turned to look at him. He had caught the other students' attention as well. But that didn't matter. Brandon raised the poster for everyone present in the room to see. You useless fucks. Why is this quest still here? From behind him, Reinhard and Liam were taken aback. Liam stood silent throughout the whole ordeal. For Reinhard, it was the first time he had seen Brandon act like this, much less curse. Boy, calm down. Brandon then turned his head and glared at Reinhard. But he quickly composed himself. Reinhard wasn't to blame. He then forcefully shoved the poster at Reinhard's chest without saying anything. Thump! As Reinhard scanned the poster, Brandon approached one of the rankers. Clenching his teeth, he scruffed the collar of the ranker closest to him. It was a man with green hair and green eyes. The man's eyes widened. He then frowned as he glared at Brandon. Fucking kid. Let go of me. The man grabbed Brandon's wrist, trying to let go of his hold. But Brandon had gripped it too tightly for his hold to budge. Glaring, Brandon spat out. That quest. Why didn't any of you take it? It's been sitting there for more than a fucking month. 2302. Fuck are you talking about? This. Reinhard spoke for Brandon as he stood beside him. He raised the poster for the man to see. The man scanned the poster and alternated his gaze between Reinhard and Brandon. His gaze then eventually landed on Brandon. Glaring, the man opened his mouth. Do you see the reward? It's too fucking low. I need to make a living. 27 coppers is as good as one meal. Snap. Something snapped within Brandon. If it was all on impulse, didn't know. This world, it was filled with garbage. And to the author of this world, fuck you. Thud. Brandon then forcefully pushed the man down on the table, gripping his collar tightly. Reward? There's a little girl missing out there. And all you care about is the fucking reward. You kids don't know shit. The man spat at Brandon's face and continued. Astria Academy? A school for stuck-up brats. That's what you are. As soon as the man spoke those words, blue flames materialized from Brandon's hand. Vush! The flames gradually started burning the man's collar. But the man only glared at him. Choose your fights, kid. Fight? I'll kill you instead. All of a sudden, mana started to emit from the man. It seemed like he tried to conjure up a magic skill. But it didn't work. It was way too subtle for anyone to notice. Not the man, not the rankers, not the other students, not even Reinhard. The man's eyes widened in shock. Oh, he tried to conjure up another magic skill again. But once again, it didn't work. Fuck, what's going? All of a sudden, ice started to materialize from Brandon's hand. CR. Crack. The ice gradually crawled on the man's neck. And before he knew it, the ice had already encircled around his entire neck. Because the climate was cold in Everglade, the ice left the man with an agonizing frostbite. Ach! The man screamed. Deviant. KHHH. Brandon knew this was all he could do at the moment. If he killed him then and there, another Felix incident would happen again. He had already managed to clear any connections between him and Moriarty. The man wasn't worth all the trouble. But, phoo! With wind in his hand, Brandon thrusted his palms forward, sending the man hurling away. Crash! Crashing on the wall, the man slumped down with his eyes wide open. The other rankers stood there in shock, but no words escaped their mouths. The last thing they wanted was to mess with an Astria student. No, to mess with Brandon Locke. The other students stood in shock as well, but they were utterly speechless at what had just happened. This time, Reinhard understood the situation and did not try to stop Brandon. At that, Brandon strode forward towards the exit with the quest poster in his hand. No words needed to be said as Reinhard and Liam followed him shortly after. There were no guarantees if he could accomplish the quest within a day, let alone accomplish it at all. In the first place, he had no leads. But there was one person he could ask to assist him in solving the missing person case. Who else but Sherlock? Seated face to face with Amy, Raven sipped on his coffee. As he did so, his eyes lit up. In front of him, Amy flashed him a wide grin. How is it? It's good. For the first time in his life, Raven had finally admitted to himself that coffee was good. But it wasn't the kind of bitter coffee that he was used to. With a smile, Amy held her head with her hands, leaning close to look at Raven. Hee, I told you. This coffee, it's different. What is it called? A macchiato. Mac? Macchiato. It became apparent to Raven that Amy had been quite comfortable with him ever since they studied together. Brandon was usually cold towards him, while Reinhard would often teach him things he would rather not want to learn. For him, being with Amy felt quite refreshing. She's a good friend, is what he thinks. Placing the coffee down, Raven looked at Amy, who was sipping on her own coffee. About the quest. I haven't picked one yet. HM? That's fine. Sip. We can pick one together. Yes, but I don't believe in easy quests. There's a reason they were requested in the first place. Raven paused and looked around. He then looked back at Amy and continued, which is why I gathered information first. Oh, Amy was quite taken aback. Raven was really thorough when it came to anything. This was a habit he had built up ever since he was young. And because of that, he was now a special officer trainee. Sherlock, the title he had earned within the group. Looking around, Raven leaned close to Amy's ear. Amy flinched slightly. Her ears instantly turned red. But Raven didn't notice and softly whispered her ear. This city, at first glance, it seems peaceful. But he paused and took a deep breath, then continued. Every year, there's a missing person case. Amy's eyes shot wide open. She stayed quiet for a moment to digest the information. Once she did, she looked at Raven, who leaned back in his seat. Why haven't they reported it back to the main city? They couldn't. What? Amy leaned back in her seat in shock. Then what about the rankers here? Can't they put up a quest for it? Raven crossed his arms. He then opened his mouth. That's the thing. It wasn't explicitly stated, but from what I could deduce, most of the rankers who tried to leave this place had gone missing as well. Once again, Amy stayed silent. The sudden revelation seemed to shake her to the core as she started rubbing her shoulders. There was one thing she wanted to ask, but the very thought of it made her shudder in fear. Lifting her head up, she looked at Raven. Pursing her lips, she asked the very same question she didn't want an answer to. 2303. Then, what happened to us too once we leave? But Raven didn't respond. He wore a look of anxiety. It was then when he opened his mouth. I'm not sure. For whatever reason the Academy sent them to Everglade, Raven didn't know. It seemed less likely that the Academy even knew what was going on in Everglade. If it was just a normal trip where they would have the leisure to relax, then Raven wouldn't have snooped around and discovered Everglade's dark secret. The quests. It was for that reason that Raven did so. Then did the professors know anything? Raven didn't know. He was at a loss once again. If even rankers would go missing, then what about students? How could the Academy or the professors expect a bunch of first years to resolve Everglade's problem? While he was lost in his thoughts, he was immediately snapped out of it as his phone started to vibrate from his pocket. Noticing, Raven retrieved his phone. As he scanned to find out who the caller was, his anxiety had toned down a bit. It was the person he had wanted to brainstorm with about the current situation. Click. Hello. Raven, where are you? It was Brandon. I'm in the hotel's cafe. Okay, wait for me. I'll be there in an hour. All right. I wanted to talk to you about something too. Have you found out as well? As expected, Brandon knew something. Raven knew that Brandon was smart. If there was someone who could keep up with his intellect, then it would be none other than Brandon. Yes. Okay, that makes things easier. See you then. Okay. Click. Putting his phone back in his pocket, Raven glanced at Amy, who seemed like she wanted to say something. And so she did as she opened her mouth. Who was that? Brandon. I see. Maybe he can find a solution to this. I hope so. She's not responding. After leaving the guild hub, Brandon had been trying to call Sarah for 30 minutes or so. But every time he did, Sarah wouldn't respond. Because of that, Brandon had split up with Reinhard and Liam started running around the city. He had asked the citizens if they knew where the Ori residence was, but all they would tell him was that they didn't. HHA. Taking deep, heavy breaths, Brandon decided to stop for a while. His method was inefficient, which is why he decided to go to the hotel and meet up with Raven. Catching his breath, Brandon entered the cafe. From a distance, he immediately spotted Raven and Amy. Realizing, his brows raised skeptically. This is definitely a date. And he was about to third-wheel them. But there was no time to think of such thoughts. He immediately approached them. They noticed his sudden appearance. Raven moved aside and Brandon sat next to him. Since Brandon ran towards the hotel, his mouth was quite parched. Noticing the coffee on the table, he extended his hand to grab it. But before he took a sip, he turned to look at Raven, who looked at him back skeptically. May I? Go ahead. Thanks. Sip. Sipping on the coffee, he redirected his attention to Amy, who looked at him with widened eyes. Placing the coffee back down on the table, Brandon cocked his head at her. What? But Amy didn't respond and continued to stare at him with an open mouth. It seemed like she wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't leave her mouth. But then it did as she pursed her lips. You. That was... what? An indirect. Amy muttered the last words as silently as she could. But she failed to do so, as Brandon heard it anyway. Kiss. But Brandon shrugged it off and turned his attention back to Raven, who seemed to not have heard Amy. Shrugging, Brandon opened his mouth. So, what do you know? Taking a deep breath, Raven briefly looked at Amy, then back at Brandon. He began to recount everything he had told Amy. It took no more than 5 minutes, and by the time he finished, Brandon was pinching his chin, appearing deep in thought. 2306. I see. There's definitely something going on in this city. Agreed. All right, it's my turn. Brandon then retrieved the missing person quest poster and placed it on the table. It was now his turn to debrief on them on what happened. Raven appeared to be listening the whole time as he stayed silent. But as soon as Brandon finished, Raven's eyes darted around as if he had not listened at all. Glancing around, Raven awkwardly opened his mouth. He seemed to be struggling to choose his words. But eventually he spoke up. "Who's Sarah?" Even Amy was taken aback. Inside her office, Evelyn was piling up the documents which contained details about the trip the first years were having. But as she piled them up, one of the documents slipped out and slowly fell on the floor. Placing the stack of documents on the table, Evelyn leaned down to pick up the fallen document. Everglade. Her eyes widened. The other sections had their trip in urban places. Much less, they didn't even have quests unlike Section A and B. And in the first place, Everglade wasn't a popular city to visit. She had heard rumors about the place during her time in the guild. It was quite peculiar. It was supposed to be a trip, and yet they had given the students a task. Isn't Vanessa their advisor? How did something like this get approved? But as she continued to scan the document, the signature section caught her attention. This, the headmaster's signature. It was forged. From what he had heard from the other students, the person he needed to find was in the guild hub. Drip, drip. He continued to walk around until a familiar figure appeared before him. Her black hair that was supposed to be tied in a ponytail was now flowing down her shoulders. The rain had drenched it to the point where she looked like she had just taken a shower. Her entire figure was drenched. From a distance, she looked tall. No, she was tall. Taller than all of the girls in Brandon's friend group. She appeared lost. Her eyes were puffy, and Brandon couldn't tell if her face was wet due to the rain or because she was crying. But most likely it was the latter. Eventually their gazes met. Thump! Her legs gave out, and she slumped down on the ground. Realizing, Brandon immediately rushed towards her. Sob, sob. And as expected, she was crying. Protecting her from the rain with the umbrella, Brandon stayed silent, letting Sarah break down under the rain. This persisted until Sarah lifted her head up to look at Brandon. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. But Brandon just looked down at her with a worried expression. Eventually the silence was broken by Sarah. Sobbing, her lips parted open. Brandon, she seemed hesitant, but Brandon had a rough idea of what she wanted to say. Sarah's mouth was left agape. She didn't finish her statement. Thus, Brandon decided to finish it for her. "I'll find your sister." As those words left his mouth, Sarah's eyes widened as if she was saying, "How did you know?" Sob, sob. Her eyes squinted and she broke down once again. She leaned down on the cold, hard ground, just in front of Brandon's shoe. Brandon stood still in silence with the umbrella in his hand. Drip, drip. No words were exchanged between the two as the rain continued to heavily pour down, drowning out Sarah's cry. Brandon clenched his fist at the sight. Looking ahead, he narrowed his eyes. His mouth parted open to silently mutter, "Oliver White." Inside the guild hub, Oliver had a serious situation. Walking around the halls, he had finally found his destination. He was supposed to be familiar with the guild hub's interior layout, but recently they changed it. Where's he headed to? The bathroom. Much better. Coming out of the bathroom, Oliver zipped his pants up. Oliver. It was Sarah. 2307. A voice suddenly reached his ears. Turning around, what met his sight was a man with pale white hair and ice-blue eyes. He was taller than Oliver as well. Of course, Oliver knew who this was. Who else could it be? The man that called out to him was regarded as the strongest first year. Scanning, Brandon seemed to have waited for him. He was leaning on the wall with his arms crossed. But Oliver wasn't startled. In fact, it was better than he thought. "Brandon, what are you doing here?" The missing person case. And as expected, Brandon picked up on it. Drip, drip. It had already started raining. Inside the small house was Sarah and her mother, seated face to face in the kitchen. The two had not spoken for more than 50 minutes or so. The silence. It felt suffocating. What should have been a loud and lively house was now nothing but a reminder of their loss. Loss. She's out there somewhere. Sarah. Mom. I'll find her. Standing up, Sarah locked gaze with her mother. Her eyes were puffy and snot started to drip down. But her eyes were determined. But the determination was all on the surface. Her heart was heavy, and she could feel herself break down at any moment. No matter what it takes, I'll find Emma. Her mother sat in silence. But Sarah knew what that silence was. Doubt. Her mother had started doubting whether Emma was still alive or not. But this didn't infuriate Sarah. Not the least bit. It was a given. Her mother had been living alone for the past month. Sarah couldn't blame her mother. Her mother had already suffered enough. Now, it was time for Sarah to do her part. As a daughter and as an older sister, looking at her mother for the last time, Sarah's heart grew heavy. Nodding, she left shortly after. The only one left in the room was Sienna and her thoughts. She had lost all hope in finding her daughter. Every day, she would try to find Emma from dusk till dawn. She had put up a request. Yet despite all that, she had still yet to find Emma. Was she even still alive to begin with? Staring at the door that was slowly closing, Sienna's attention was caught by something peculiar on the ground. It was a doll, but for some reason, it looked familiar. Standing up, Sienna slowly approached the doll. Picking it up, she thoroughly scanned its features. Drip, drip, her tears. It started dripping once again. Before she realized it, her hands had started trembling. Her mouth had started to twitch, trying to find the words to say. But the words wouldn't leave her mouth. Thump! Her legs gave out, and before she knew it, she had already started to break down again. May, drip, drip. After exchanging information, Brandon had decided not to involve Raven and Amy further. The current predicament was out of the novel plotline. Brandon wasn't sure what kind of growth it would give the main cast. It was too risky. The case might be even bigger than they thought, and would eventually lead to one of the main cast's deaths. Brandon couldn't allow that. At times like these, he had wished that he still had Alpha, a subordinate to assist him. Right, there was no Alpha in the first place. But there was one specific detail that caught his attention. It was Amy who had brought it up. The entire trip, Amy was in contact with her friend from the other classes. And it seemed like only Section A and Section B school trip was unusual. While they were running around doing quests in a rural countryside city, the other classes were having the time of their lives in a more populated and urban city. Everglade. Quests. There had to be a connection. It was with that conclusion that Brandon had decided to approach a specific person. And that person was where he was headed to. Hopefully, he would get all the answers he needed. Drip, drip. Walking around the city with an umbrella, his footsteps were drowned out by the sound of the rain. It made sense why Brandon would act that way. In Brandon's eyes, Oliver was suspicious. Brandon was silent. Thus, Oliver was the one to break the silence as he walked slowly towards Brandon. His lips parted open and silently spoke. The matter is quite private. Let's discuss it somewhere else. Brandon didn't respond and nodded. Oliver then walked ahead of him, and Brandon followed shortly after. Noticing someone peeking from the hallway, Oliver paused. It was Sarah. That girl. Don't involve her further. She's already lost enough. What do you know about her? A lot more than you know. More than enough. I see. Brandon slowly closed his eyes. Opening his eyes, Brandon pursed his lip. That's all I needed to know. Cracka! Blue sparks of lightning started to coil around Brandon like a snake. At the same time, a wind barrier had formed and meshed around the lightning. Step! Walking towards Oliver, whose eyes were shot wide open. He was being pushed back onto the wall by the wind pressure. CR. Crack. KHH. W hat are you? Brandon suddenly grabbed his neck. Narrowing his eyes, Brandon tightened his grip on Oliver's neck. Of course, if it was a normal fight, Oliver would be leaps and bounds stronger than Brandon. But that was if Brandon was any other regular mage. Mana disruption. No matter what kind of skill Oliver would use, it wouldn't materialize. He didn't know how to counter Brandon's outrageous skill. Not like he was actively trying to hurt Brandon in the first place. But still, it was absurd. Wait up. Brandon gripped his neck even more tighter. Oliver's veins had started to pop out, and his face was slowly turning purple. Holding onto Brandon's hand, Oliver tried to formulate his words. This is a misunderstanding. KHH. Squinting his eyes, Brandon's lips parted open. What am I supposed to be misunderstanding here? Let me go first, KHH. But Brandon didn't budge. All of a sudden, the area around Brandon had started shifting. Widening his eyes, Brandon looked around. Green flames had started to wrap the area. The space around him was slowly becoming isolated. Brandon knew what this was. Zone. Oliver used his zone. At that very moment, green flames had started to form around Brandon's hand and slowly crept up on his arm. The green flames had started to burn his entire arm, and his grip on Oliver's neck immediately gave out. Massaging his neck, Oliver looked at Brandon. Snap! With a snap of his finger, the green flames had disappeared. His voice then reached Brandon. Like I said, you're misunderstanding everything. Brandon knew he was acting on impulse, but it couldn't be helped. Oliver was way stronger than him. The surprise attack was his only advantage. But Brandon kept the guard up and turned to look at Oliver. Narrowing his eyes, Brandon's mouth parted open. What do you mean? I need your help. Brandon's eyes widened. Oliver continued. You're the only one who actually cared about the missing person case. All the other cowards actively ignored it. You're the only one I can ask. All of a sudden, Oliver kneeled down and pleaded in front of Brandon. Please help Everglade. At that, Brandon's eyes shot wide open. It was for that reason that he decided to approach him once he found out that the other sections didn't have any quests. It could have been Vanessa, but she wasn't there when they were debriefed about the quests. And most likely, she didn't even know. But why him? Oliver was way stronger than him. If Everglade was in trouble, then he could have done it alone. Much less, ask help from the academy. But as if his thoughts were seemingly read, Oliver turned to look at him. I can't do it alone. I've fucking pleaded with the guild. But they wouldn't help a small city like Everglade. He clenched his fist, and as soon as he did, green flames had started to form. I've told them everything, and yet, the green flames had started to wrap his behind like an aura. They think it's a fucking joke. Children have gone missing for the past year, and they won't even let me meet with the strongest ranker. He turned to look at Brandon with pleading eyes. This was the only thing I could do to get the guild's attention. I know it's ridiculous to ask a student, but Oliver looked down with a sad expression. Clenching his fist, his mouth parted open. Please help me. With widened eyes, Brandon was taken aback. His mouth opened, but no words came out. He couldn't find the right words to say as silence filled the entire zone. There were others he could have asked for help from. With his thoughts gathered, Brandon eventually broke the silence. You could have asked Evelyn or Vanessa. In fact, Vanessa's already here. I've already done that. Oh, Brandon blinked. Then what about Evelyn? I couldn't ask her directly, but I've left some clues behind. Is this guy serious? This guy, he had dragged everyone into this mess out of their own volition. It wasn't right. Oliver wasn't right. But looking at him, he seemed to look desperate. No, it wouldn't be a stretch to say that he might have a screw loose in the head. If this was his last attempt in saving his city, then it was a stupid plan. He could have done something else. But no, this was the conclusion he had come up with. In the end, Brandon could only offer his assistance. After all, it was related to the missing person case. All to save Emma Ori. It's not like he was doing it to score points with Sarah. No, just the thought of a little girl out there lost, and crying made Brandon's heart heavy. Once again, this world, it was garbage. At that, Oliver started to recount everything that had happened in Everglade. After leaving Amy back at the hotel, Raven decided to roam around for more information. Despite Brandon assuring him that the current information was sufficient, Raven decided to offer additional help anyway. The first thing on his agenda is to go to the nearby police station. Entering inside the police station, there were officers who sat around everywhere. They looked incompetent. There were empty cups on the floor and donuts laying around the table. Some of the officers were asleep, while some were fiddling on their phones. Raven was taken aback. The entire station was a mess, and it seemed like none of the officers took their job seriously. With such thoughts, Raven called out to them. Hey! At his call, some of the officers were startled as they looked back at him, while the ones who were asleep continued in their slumber. Raven then retrieved something from his pocket. Flashing it for everyone present to see, their eyes were wide open. Oh, wake up. A special force officer is here. NG Chach, shut up. Smack. One of the officers smacked the one who was asleep. Rubbing his head, the officer frowned. fuck was that for? He then noticed Raven's appearance. Oh, officer, what can we do for you? Breathing out a sigh, Raven stepped forward. I need all your documents regarding missing person cases. All of them. Officer, that's a bit. Now, Raven squinted his eyes. Realizing the seriousness in his tone, all of the officers quickly got to work. It took more than an hour for the officers to gather all the documents. And by the time they were done, the sun was about to set. For the next few hours, Raven sat on one of the chairs and thoroughly scanned each document. Flipping each document, there was nothing peculiar about them, or at least nothing that had caught his attention. After flipping for the 267th document, Raven's eyes widened in surprise. What? Missing person. Date, October 30th, 2142. Oliver White. 6 years ago. Oi, come back here. That's why it's running away, Claire. You keep scaring it. Fuck. For the entire day, Claire and Rachel had been trying to accomplish their quest. What quest? Finding a lost cat. Though they've already found it a few hours ago, it would always escape their grasp. And before they knew it, they were already far out into the forest. Scrunch, scrunch. Silence gripped the entire area with only the sound of foliage breaking it. Once again, the cat was gone. There it is. Extending her hand in the cat's direction, Claire pointed at it. Noticing the raise in her tone, Rachel turned her head towards the direction. But before the cat could enter her peripheral view, Claire had already run off to chase it. Claire, wait. No, I'm already starving. We've been at this for the entire day. Truth be told, they didn't have to do the quest. It was optional. But ever since falling off the rankings, Claire had been on a tight budget. Her allowance was cut off for the time being. And Rachel, she was a cheapskate. Where is? Shading her eyes with her hand, Claire tried to look for the cat who was gone again. There. Where? Yeah. Because of Claire's voice, the cat was startled once again. It went inside that run-down cabin. That makes it easier then. 2254. MHM. The cat had isolated itself, something that mages could work with. But doesn't that cabin look kind of creepy? Yeah. Rubbing her shoulders, Rachel was hesitant to step forward. Oi, creepy or not, let's just get this done. Rachel nodded and stepped forward. She had a bad feeling as she silently muttered, "This feels like a horror movie scene." What was that? And nothing. At that, the two beckoned inside the cabin. Arriving at the entrance, the two took silent steps to avoid alerting the cat. The door is open as well. Claire had a bad feeling as well. But in the end, they were mages. Just a little creepy old cabin wouldn't scare them. As soon as they entered the cabin, a chill ran down the two's spine. What the? Are those? Dolls. Looking around, the entire cabin was filled to the brim with dolls in each shelf. What kind of sicko would collect these kinds of dolls? Claire roamed around the room and scanned the dolls. The dolls appeared to be handmade, most likely sewed. Rachel approached one of the dolls and extended her hand to grab it. As she scanned the doll, a sudden chill ran down her spine. These dolls, don't they look kind of real? Don't be crazy, Rachel. How could a sewed doll look real? The clothes look sewed, but the face, it looks real. But Rachel was snapped out of it as she turned her head to look at Claire. Wait, the cat. All right. Fuck, where is it? Rachel lowered her head to look at the doll again, only to find the doll's eyes suddenly turned pitch black, and she could have sworn it was smiling back at her. Thud! A chill ran down her spine, and she dropped the doll. What in the? But when she turned to scan the doll again, it appeared normal. Was it just her imagination? But whatever it was, Rachel could say that it was definitely creepy. Claire seemed to have the same thoughts as her voice reached Rachel's ears. This place is creepy. Fucking creepy. Rubbing her shoulders, Rachel took a step back. She was then snapped out of her thoughts as Claire called upon her. Rachel, the cat. It isn't. Claire turned her head only to find Rachel in a kind of trance. Rachel, Rachel was snapped out of it as she spoke with an urgent tone. Forget the cat. Let's just get out of here, please. Then what about the roux? I'll pay for all your expenses. Claire was taken aback. Ruffling her hair, she seemed to have noticed the urgency in Rachel's voice. She then cursed under her breath. Oh, fuck. All that running around for nothing. All right, fine. At that, the two then turn around to leave. But as they arrived at the exit, a shadow loomed over them. A thin man with gray disheveled hair and lavender eyes stood by the exit. Claire was startled, but not as much as Rachel. Skeptically raising her brow, Claire greeted the figure that had arrived. Hello. Do you live here? Yes. His voice was raspy, and just the sight of the man sent chills down Rachel's spine. Her alarm bells were ringing, but Claire seemed to have not noticed it. Rubbing her head, Claire pursed her lips. We're sorry for the intrusion. We didn't think anyone lived here. We'll be going now. It's nothing. Rachel couldn't speak up. There was something eerily creepy about the man that she couldn't quite put her finger on. Noticing her silence, Claire turned to look at her and frowned. Rachel, don't be rude. But Rachel didn't respond and shook her head. Claire then turned to look at the man and tried to be as polite as she could. Sorry about my friend. She's quite the introvert. The man then stepped forward and he opened his mouth. What about a doll before you go? No. This time, Rachel finally voiced out her thoughts. Laughing, Claire tried to keep her tone polite to avoid being rude to the man. Sorry. We don't need anything. You can keep the dolls, sir. Claire then walked ahead, leading Rachel's hand and stood by the exit. Turning around, Claire gave her farewells. If you excuse us, sir, we'll be going now. MHM. It was at that moment when they realized they couldn't move. What the? The two quickly turned their heads around. The man wasn't there anymore. An ominous presence started to bore down on them. A sense of pressure started to grip them. And the pressure, it came from the front. The two slowly turned their heads back in front. And that was when they saw the man from a distance. The two were taken aback. With wide eyes, they started to tremble. Fear, the sense of dread, loomed over them. And the two could not find the right words to say. The man, he was smiling. His eyes, they were pitch black. The sound of laughter coming from behind them. A child's laugh. Turning around to trace the source of the sound. What met their sight was a doll that stood on its own on the floor. Its eyes were pitch black, just like the man's. More laughter. Another doll chimed in from a shelf. And another one. More dolls. Until an innumerable amount of dolls had all started to move gradually. Rachel's body continued to shudder in fear. Even if she wanted to move, she couldn't. And even if she could move, the fear had already gripped her to the point where her legs were frozen. Her stomach started to churn from the gripping fear as her mouth continued to twitch. The only sound that echoed throughout the entire cabin was the sound of children's laughter. When Rachel turned to look at the man, that was when she noticed threads. They were unable to move due to the threads. The man stood still with a smile, his pitch-black eyes staring deep into their souls. And that was when, the sound of a little girl screaming. 6 years ago, it was another cold day in Everglade. In fact, it was snowing. The sun was nowhere to be seen, and it was freezing cold. But growing up in Everglade, Oliver was used to the cold. Come on, Oliver. Hurry up, a voice called out to him, with black hair and lavender eyes. It was his senior in the small guild he was in. Yeah, David. Have you told your family we're all going out today? I forgot. We'll come back anyway. What's the big deal? Oliver was used to this. David was always quite the eccentric person. Are you sure you should even take part in this subjugation? Your wife is pregnant, you know. I know. Which is why it's better if I didn't tell her. What kind of father? But Oliver cleared his thoughts. David's family was none of his business. All right, your soon-be-born child. Have you given the name some thought? Pinching his chin, David pondered for a while. Oliver was quite taken aback. After spending time with David in the guild for 3 years, he was still as irresponsible as ever. Seriously? Wait. Give me time to think. And then, David's eyes lit up. Pursing his lips, he turned to look at Oliver. If it's a boy, I'll name him David too. And if it's a girl, maybe Emma. Emma Ori, not bad. Right? I'll have you know, I was the one who named Sarah as well. All right, your firstborn. Yup. Noticing that the other guild members were by the exit, the two hurriedly made it to their side. Currently, there were some disturbances in the forest. There were no reports on what was the cause, but they decided to take action. Unlike the main city, Everglade was far out in the countryside. There would often be reports of mana beasts or wraith beasts. Mana beasts were within their capabilities, while for wraith beasts, they would have quite the difficulty. But if it were wraith beasts, then they had their trump card. David Ori, a mage with the Curse Affinity and an A ranker. Despite the prejudice of the Curse Affinity, David had built up quite the reputation. Oliver had the Curse Affinity as well. Normally, he wouldn't even qualify to join the guild, but David decided to pick him up. At that, the group ventured forth, arriving at the city's main gate. But then they paused as a little girl stood in front of them. Her long flowing black hair cascaded around her shoulders. Her lavender eyes sparkled from the sunlight. Her expressions formed a frown as she called upon her father. "Dad, you're leaving again?" David was startled to see his daughter. He didn't expect Sarah to be waiting for him by the gate. "Ah, Sarah, what a surper. Mom is about to give birth. Are you not going to come to see my little sibling?" David leaned down and patted the 10-year-old Sarah on the head. "Sarah, if I don't do this, then we wouldn't even live to see tomorrow." Oliver stood there in shock. What kind of father would say such scary things to his own daughter? "Sarah, don't worry. Daddy will be there in time to see David too." "Emma." Sarah's eyes lit up. "You finally thought a name?" "Of course. What kind of father wouldn't?" Once again, Oliver was taken aback. In fact, he gave him a skeptical look. Ruffling his daughter's head once more, David flashed the little Sarah smile. He then grabbed something from his bag. Leaning down, he extended his hand to give it to the little Sarah. "Here, what is this?" Seeing the sight, Oliver stifled a laugh. David had given his daughter a doll, and yet she couldn't even tell if it was. "I've been learning how to make these, Sarah." "A handkerchief. Daddy will see you later, Sarah." MHM. At that, the bee's subjugation had begun. In the first place, they didn't think it would be that difficult. Turning around, David turned to look at the 10-year-old Sarah, who waved at them with conflicted expressions. He then flashed his daughter's smile. That smile, it was his last smile. At the start, there were a total of 15 members in the group. Now, there were only 2 left. What they thought were just some beasts was actually a wraith. Fuck. HHA. In front of the wraith, they were helpless. Not once had they even managed to leave a scratch on it. The wraith was of a lower class. A lesser to be exact. If compared to a ranker, a lesser would be of the same rank as an S+ ranker. But unfortunately, the highest ranker they had was an A rank David Ori. Oliver lay on the ground while David gave it his all to buy some time. Oliver didn't want to die. No one wanted to die. But the fear had frozen Oliver in place as he watched David single-handedly fending off the wraith. Run. His instincts told him so. Run away. He got up. Save yourself. His legs had started to move. Oliver. When David turned around, Oliver wasn't there anymore. Realizing that his guild mate and friend had abandoned him, David stifled a laugh. I can't blame him. He's still young. Drip. Drip. Tears started to flow down his eyes. But I have a fucking family. With the cursed threads in his hand, David thrusted his palms onto the wraith. If this could buy enough time for the main guild to take notice, then so be it. A magic circle had materialized. Splurt. The wraith had thrusted its fist inside David's chest. KHH. Bastard. I'll seal you if it's the last thing I do. At that moment, the wraith had gradually merged with David. He wasn't confident that he could even overpower the wraith with his mental strength. But it was all he could do. The wraith would suffer the limitations of the human body. But to his surprise, the wraith was far stronger than his mental strength. Sienna, Sarah, Emma, or David too. I'm sorry. The last words he could ever mutter before the wraith took hold of his body. But, Wapea, a final-ditch attempt. With the last of his strength, David placed a curse on his own body. A binding vow. In exchange, he would lose all sense of reasoning. The wraith possessing his body would be unable to leave the forest. If it does, then his body would perish. Was it a good idea? David didn't know. From a distance, Oliver watched the entire scene unfold. The guilt gripped him immensely. He had abandoned the man who took him in when he had nothing. Drip. Drip. Tears flowed down his cheek. He knew the kind of sin he had committed. He was a coward. Fuck. A weakling. Fuck. He slumped down. Bang. And smacked the cold, hard ground. Drip. Drip. Tears kept flowing out. But what was the point? His tears were nothing but a means to justify his actions. Fuck. On that day, 13 deaths were confirmed, leading to the guild's disbandment. It was then announced that 2 were missing, as their bodies were never found. David Ori and Oliver White. And on that day, Emma Ori was born. Sarah had that kind of past. Brandon was taken aback. For someone that wasn't part of the main cast, Sarah's past was even more deeper than the others of the main cast. Looking up, Oliver had a resigned expression. Just like Brandon, he didn't know what to say next. Silence gripped the entire zone. And before they knew it, it had already started to dematerialize. Slowly, the green flames around the area diminished. The dark veil that wrapped the sky like a dome had gradually started cracking. Crack. At that, the zone was lifted. As Brandon looked around, it seemed like Sarah was nowhere to be seen. He then turned to look at Oliver. So, meeting his gaze, Oliver's mouth parted open. David might still be inside there somewhere. It was less likely. It had been 6 years since the incident. Recalling Oliver's story, Brandon pinched his chin and pondered. Those missing person cases. They were the people that had entered the forest, weren't they? Most likely. And what happened to them? I'm not too sure. How useless. Just like he was in the past. Oliver had never changed. All of a sudden, Brandon's phone rang. Reaching for his pocket, he then retrieved his phone. Raven Blackheart. Ring, ring, click. Brandon, we have a situation. Talk. Rachel and Claire, they're nowhere to be seen. Brandon's eyes widened in shock. Frowning, he clenched his phone tightly. Forest now. Click. The conversation was brief, but he knew Raven would understand. At that, Brandon immediately rushed towards the hallway's exit. Noticing Brandon's sudden urgency, Oliver called out to him. Where are you going? Fast. Lead me to the forest. Oliver was taken aback, but it seemed like the situation was dire. At that, he immediately rushed towards Brandon and led the advance. Arriving at the guild hub's exit, a familiar figure stood by the exit. Sarah, no time to explain, come. W. He then grabbed Sarah's hand and continued the advance. Oliver was ahead of them. Brandon and Sarah followed him closely. Rachel and Claire continued to stand still. Fixed in position, the threads gripped their body tightly. Rachel could feel the threads slowly sapping away her strength and stamina. Why? What kind of threads are the? Her thoughts were then broken as Claire's voice anxiously rang. Rachel. As Rachel looked ahead, figures started to emerge from the bushes. Her. A sudden growl echoed from the distance. Rachel had a rough idea of what it was. She had read about them when she was studying on wraiths with Brandon. As her lips continued to tremble, she muttered out the words that not even Claire wanted to hear. Wraith beasts. A calamity that is usually in the B to a rank category. There were exceptions. However, those exceptions were one of myths. A regular wraith beast was currently out of their league. Most first-year students would be categorized in the F to E rank, with the exception of Brandon and Raven, who would most likely belong to the D to C rank, while the rest below the top 10 to 3 would most likely be in the E to D rank. It was absurd, but there was no use in comparing. Brandon was unique, having 5 affinities, while Raven had a special affinity. But recently, Rachel could feel like she was about to break through. She could feel her mana core starting to progressively grow. Just a bit more, and her ice affinity might evolve. Turning towards Claire, Rachel opened her mouth. Claire, can you do something about these threads? I've been trying, but it won't budge. Frowning, Rachel started to channel her mana. Crack. All of a sudden, frost bolts had started to materialize behind Rachel. With a slight movement of her hand, the frost bolts launched towards the man. Shio! The man's figure blurred, giving the illusion of him disappearing, dodging all the frost bolts in the process. Clicking her tongue, frost bolts continued to materialize and pierce through the air. But once again, it was to no avail. Cracka! From beside her, Purple lightning engulfed Claire and started crawling up to the threads. However, the threads adjusted, and both Claire and Rachel instantly crashed onto the wall behind them. Boom! Splinters scattered everywhere. A hole etched onto the cabin. Slowly getting up, Rachel had realized that victory was impossible as long as the threads still wrapped them around. No, the man was completely out of their league regardless. With such thoughts, Rachel decided to break the threads in any way she could. If I succeed, I'll make a run for it. It was cold logic. How could she save Claire if she couldn't even save herself? If both of them were to fall, then who would avenge the other? Thus, Rachel started to channel her mana once more. Ice started to crawl from her feet to her legs to her torso, slowly and slowly, until they started engulfing the threads. Hi-ya! The children's screams. Hurr! The wraith beast growl. Step! The man slowly walked towards them. All of a sudden, his hands started moving and the threads started tightening. Whatever Rachel was trying to do, it was to no avail. CR crack. The ice had wrapped the threads, only for it to shatter. No matter what she did, the threads wouldn't break. In the first place, Rachel didn't know what kind of affinity the threads belonged to. But she had to keep trying. Drip, drip. The threads were tightening and blood started to drip, leaving a slit on Rachel's torso. Turning beside her, Claire's complexions start to pale. Unlike Rachel, who was slowing down the blood loss with ice, Claire couldn't do such a thing. The man waved his hand around, as if he was a puppeteer. All of a sudden, Rachel's body was lifted up. Drip, drip. As the threads got even tighter, blood kept dripping. What was the man's goal? Was he trying to torture them? What were the dolls even for? Why do they sound like children? And just what kind of creature is the man? No, Rachel knew it already, but she didn't want to admit it. The sheer fact that if her speculation was proven true made her entire body shudder. And before she knew it, 3 wraith beasts had already encircled them. They were being fed to the beasts. After all, just like mana beasts, wraith beasts would empower their strength by feasting on mana. In that case, CR, crack. Rachel completely encapsulated herself in a thick shell of ice. Then, extending the radius of her mana, the ice slowly crawled to her side. Crack! All of a sudden, Claire was inside the thick layer of ice as well. A large ice shell in the shape of a gem had now encapsulated the two. Crack! Crack! The wraith beast had started biting into the ice. Cracks had started to form. But as Rachel continued supplying it with mana, the shell would instantly fix itself. She could feel her mana starting to drain, but she had to persist. If they were gone for far too long, the professors would notice. Brandon would notice. Would they be able to find them in time? Rachel didn't know, but it was worth a try. Better than letting ourselves become wraith food. Raven, Brandon, the two had finally caught up just in time as they were about to enter the forest. Amy was there as well, surprised by Brandon's sudden appearance, along with several others. Noticing Oliver, Raven turned to meet his gaze. Professor, Raven. The only exchange the two had. It was quite awkward. Then, Raven noticed the girl behind Brandon. Is this Sarah? Yeah. Brandon responded as he glanced at Sarah from behind him. Noticing his gaze, Sarah awkwardly introduced herself. I'm Sarah Ori. She gave a light bow. Raven nodded and squinted his eyes as he turned to look at Oliver. It seemed like he was wary of the professor, which is why Brandon had recounted everything Oliver had told him in detail. Sarah wasn't an exception, and she had finally learned the truth about her father's disappearance. Her eyes shot wide open as she silently listened to everything Brandon was saying. She couldn't find the right words to say. Grasping her hands were trembling. But seeing her expression, Brandon gave her a look of understanding. It was all too much for her at the moment. That much was certain. So, my father is still alive? There's a Chan. No. Before Oliver could spout more bullshit, Brandon cut him off. Shut up, Oliver. Don't give her false hope. The others were immediately taken aback. But in the end, Brandon was right. With a conflicted expression, Sarah lifted her head to meet Brandon's gaze. My sister, is she? Before Sarah could finish, Brandon approached her and extended his arms to her shoulders. Locking gaze with Sarah, he pursed his lips. I'll do my best to find her, but there are no guarantees. Sarah couldn't respond. Of course she couldn't. Brandon was beating around the bush. Even he had doubts whether Emma was still alive or not. And in all honesty, Sarah had started to doubt it as well. It was the cold, hard truth. Truth be told, Sarah didn't know how to feel after finding out the truth. She was a logical person. Even if Oliver had stayed and fought the Wraith, he would have died in the process. But she secretly gritted her teeth. Oi, you don't have to say it like the... Oliver stopped as soon as Brandon turned his head to glare at him. His eyes spoke enough to say that Oliver should stop butting in. In the end, Oliver could only stay silent. Suddenly, a strange growl echoed from the bushes. As Amy traced the source of the sound, she anxiously spoke up. What was that? Walking ahead of everyone, Oliver braced himself. Wraith beasts. If no one's going to come and save us, then I can only do what I can. Inside the ice shell, Rachel continuously channeled her mana. Cold. She was feeling cold. Something unheard of for a mage with the ice affinity. Crack. Crack. For what she could think had been a few minutes already, the Wraith beasts were relentless in their attacks. Her mana reserves had been strained for quite a while. Her body was getting weaker and weaker, and her complexions were pale. But after studying ice magic ever since she was young, there was a specific line from a book she just couldn't forget. To advance in the arts of ice, you must become one with the ice. And in the current situation, the words were taken literally. She was literally inside her own ice magic. Because it was made with mana, she could breathe inside. The same went for Claire. Crack. Crack. Her mana reserves were rapidly depleting. But she let out a smirk. This situation, this moment, she could feel it. Her ice affinity was evolving. Looking at her hair strand, it was gradually turning white, slowly crawling towards the crown. This, crack, crack. If it was a last-ditch attempt, then she had to try. Claire was out of commission at the moment. It was all up to Rachel. All she had to do was to break the threads. Crack, crack, just a bit more. Her body was growing numb from the cold. She didn't even shiver. Fucking cold. The entire time, the vibrations of the Wraith Beast's attack on the ice shell had made Claire's stomach churn. No, she knew she was about to vomit. After all, she didn't have that strong of a stomach. Looking at Rachel, Claire couldn't tell what was happening. Her hair was gradually turning a snow-white color, and despite being in such a helpless situation, Rachel's expressions, they were cold, one of indifference, as if the entire situation was nothing to her. Claire was taken aback at the sight. Growing up, Claire knew Rachel was the most talented between herself and Amy. The only reason Rachel was ranked lower than the two at the start of the semester was because she wanted to play the act of a mob character inspired by a recent manga she had read. Of course, Rachel failed terribly and still ranked inside the top 5. But it spoke volumes of Rachel's talent. She didn't even try, and yet her talent still shined. All of a sudden, crack, the ice shell that was supposed to encapsulate them shattered. And as soon as it did, Claire fell on her butt. The threads still wrapped around her body, sapping away her strength. And because of everything that happened, including her strength diminishing, turning around, she vomited. And as soon as she did, one of the Wraith beasts that encircled them jumped her. Realizing, Claire braced for impact, shielding her body with her arms as she wrapped her entire figure with purple sparks. CR. Crack. For some reason, the attack never came. Peering one of her eyes open, what met her sight was the Wraith beast stood frozen, not because of ice. Its entire figure had become white. No, its entire hide was draped in a pristine layer of snow. Rachel, turning her head to look at Rachel, a sudden chill ran down Claire's spine. Rachel's entire hair had turned snow white. Her eyes, which was once a crimson red, had now become a blank gray. It felt like a completely different person. Claire had a rough idea on what Rachel's new form was. An ability that mages with the special affinity had. Elemental assimilation. Evelyn was the same, as her eyes would turn a radiant gold color. But since when did Rachel break through? Foo! A snow-like aura completely engulfed Rachel's figure. She took a step forward, and the next thing she knew, the threads that seemed to wrap them had been cut off. Looking at the current Rachel, Claire could tell that she would give Reinhard a run for his money. And adding to the fact that Reinhard was a mage with the fire affinity, a complete counter to Rachel. She's way stronger. CR. Crack. Unfortunately, the Wraith Beast had broken free from its frozen state in a matter of seconds. Despite Rachel's breakthrough, it still wasn't enough to kill an A-rank Calamity Beast. But still, the threads were gone. Therefore, Claire run. At Rachel's call, Claire tried to get up, but she could still feel motion sickness. However, she persisted. Cladding herself in purple lightning, she immediately grabbed hold of Rachel. She then carried Rachel, a princess carry, and TZZZ. They sprinted away from the cabin. But to their surprise, the man immediately took notice and gave chase. Scrunch, scrunch. The sound of foliage echoed at every step that Claire took. Trails of purple sparks fluttered in the air. From behind her, she could hear the man pursuing them. How is he so fast? It made no sense, but at the same time it did. Claire had already realized the man was anything but human. The purple sparks continued to empower Claire's entire being as she sprinted as fast as she could. All of a sudden, the sense of dread washed over Claire. Peeking behind, the threads were about to reach her once again. Realizing, she immediately paused and crouched down, dodging the threads. 2,100 hours. But that split second she took to pause was all the man needed to catch up to them. The sound of children's laughter echoing from a distance. As Claire tried to stand up, a thread had managed to wrap itself around her leg. Yuwa! She was lifted up on one leg. Thud! And dropped Rachel. Standing up, Rachel's snow-white hair fluttered, cascading around her shoulders. Looking at the man, his pitch-black eyes stared deep into her soul, sending chills down her spine. Her body felt heavy. The strenuous usage of her mana should have gripped her with pain. But everything else was numb. Everything. The more she stayed under her current form, the more she knew just how severe the backlash would be. But Rachel didn't care. If she didn't give it her all, then she would die. It was a life and death moment. Step. The man stepped forward. His index finger was lifted up, indicating the thread he used to lift Claire up. Noticing his left hand, his fingers started moving. Swoosh. Noticing the approaching threads, Rachel immediately blurred backwards, leaving a trail of snow. Up! But another thread struck her calf from behind. Immediately, Rachel draped the thread in a frozen glaze, completely dismantling it. Drip! Drip! A hole etched on her calf as blood seeped from it. Gritting her teeth, she froze the gaping hole and stopped the bleeding. Should I just leave Claire and call for help? No. She instantly dismissed her thoughts. Impulsive thoughts like these often etched themselves into her mind. But Rachel was never that kind of person. Thoughts. They were just thoughts. All of a sudden, the man abruptly rushed Rachel. Threads loomed from all sides. Realizing, Rachel blurred away, dodging each thread with effort. Each step Rachel took would leave snow and ice in its wake. But no matter how fast she moved, a thread would always land a hit. Truth be told, Rachel's eyes weren't fast enough to track the threads. She was only waving her hand around wherever she thinks a thread was looming. Drip! Drip! Slits had started appearing all over her body, but she would instantly freeze them to stop further blood loss. Ichiche! Taking deep breaths, Rachel continued to narrowly dodge the threads coming from each side. Swoosh, swoosh. Every time the threads managed to wound her, she could feel her strength sapping away. It was as if the threads were eating away at her life force like a curse. A curse thread. That's what she decided to call them. HHA. Swoosh, swoosh, swoosh. Narrowly dodging the threads, Rachel managed to get close to the man. With a swipe of her hand, pristine layers of snow were left in its trail. And, boom, she managed to strike the man on the torso with her palms. Looking at him, a white circular frost appeared in his body. Despite putting all of her strength in the attack, the man didn't even flinch or stagger back. The man's index finger was slightly lowered. Noticing the subtle change, Rachel immediately turned around to see the threads around Claire loosen. Full. Swiping her hand, a thick layer of snow cascaded from above, aiming for the man's eye. If she can't beat him with strength, then she had to at least play dirty. Rachel moved around and swiped her hand up. Pristine layers of snow erupted from the ground. Faux dash. Cuts and grazed appeared all over her body. Gritting her teeth, Rachel persisted. Swiping her hand in a circular motion, a thick wall of snow and ice gradually materialized. If Rachel was in her normal state, she would definitely stifle a laugh. But she wasn't, though her impulses still got to the best of her as she continued to block the man's peripheral view. Walls of snow and ice filled the entire forest area. With that diversion, Rachel jumped up. Swiping her hand, the thread that wrapped around Claire's leg started to freeze. Crack! And shattered. Claire, TZ dash.